It's funny how the 1970s still live somewhere in the back of my mind. Soft, golden, and just a little bit hazy, like a Polaroid photo left in the sun. I remember the hum of an 8-track player in the car, the click between tracks, and the shimmer of a disco ball catching every bit of colored light. Life back then felt slower, simpler, and somehow more alive. You didn't scroll, you waited. You didn't stream, you listened. You didn't post, you developed. We'll step back into that world, when bell-bottoms brushed shag carpets, when Saturday nights meant disco lights, and when a long-distance call was still something special. From drive-in theaters to roller rinks, from transistor radios to the rise of punk. This was the decade where everything started to hum with its own rhythm. Mornings in the 1970s had a rhythm all their own. There was no buzzing phone, no glowing screen waiting for you before you even got out of bed. The day began with sound and scent, the gentle gurgle of the percolator heating on the kitchen counter and the rich aroma of coffee drifting through the house. It wasn't single serve or instant gratification. It was slow, steady, and patient. You'd pour that first cup of Maxwell House or Folgers, steam curling up as sunlight crept across the linoleum floor, and for a moment, the world felt perfectly still. Before work or school, every family had its own little morning routine. The clatter of cereal boxes being opened, Cheerios, cornflakes, maybe Captain Crunch if you were lucky, and the sound of spoons hitting ceramic bowls filled the room. Someone would be flipping through the newspaper, pages crackling softly, the ink rubbing off slightly on their fingertips. The paper was more than news. It was how we connected to the world beyond our street. The front page told us what was happening out there. Wars, elections, moon landings, scandals. But the local section, that was what mattered most. Birth announcements, high school sports scores, and who got their picture in the community column. You'd hear the rustle of the paper as someone folded it neatly in half, then again, balancing it next to their toast and marmalade. The radio might be playing softly from the windowsill, maybe Paul Harvey giving the rest of the story, or a local DJ announcing the weather and spinning Let It Be or American Pie. The music mixed with the smell of breakfast, forming a kind of morning symphony that no app or algorithm could ever recreate. In most homes, the kitchen was the heart of it all. Avocado green appliances, a round table with vinyl chairs, and a clock on the wall that seemed to tick a little slower. Moms packed lunches into brown paper bags, slipping in a note or a few quarters for milk. Dads adjusted their ties. Kids argued over who got the last slice of toast. And somewhere in the background, the dog barked at the mailman. It wasn't chaos exactly, more like a comfortable kind of noise that meant the house was alive. The television stayed off in the mornings, unless it was Saturday. On weekdays, people respected the quiet. You had to earn your entertainment after school, after work, after dinner. Mornings were about getting ready to face the world, one cup of coffee and one headline at a time. The air outside always smelled different back then, crisp, clean, with a faint trace of gasoline and fresh-cut grass. The hum of engines warming up in driveways mixed with the creak of screen doors closing and the faint sound of kids calling goodbye as they ran toward the bus stop. Everyone left home with something small that grounded them. A packed lunch, a folded paper, a song stuck in their head from the morning radio. The pace was slower, deliberate. People waved at neighbors. You knew the name of your mailman and the sound of your dad's car pulling out of the driveway. And even though life was far from simple, bills still needed paying, and clocks still ticked, it all somehow felt gentler. When I think of those mornings now, I remember the warmth of that first sip of coffee and the faint hum of life outside the window. There was a softness to the world then, before everything became instant, before everything was recorded. We weren't chasing updates, we were living inside them. The front page might have told us what was happening everywhere else, but the real news was right there in the kitchen. The smell of toast, the chatter, the laughter, and the steady, comforting sound of a coffee percolator finishing its last bubbling breath. And when you finally stepped outside, newspaper tucked under your arm, the world greeted you with open skies and the distant sound of a neighbor's lawn mower starting up. The sunlight glinted off chrome bumpers and mailboxes, and for a brief second, it felt like time itself waited for you to catch up. That's how the 70s began each day, not with a rush, but with a rhythm, a calm, steady heartbeat that set the tone for everything that came after. If the kitchen was the heart of the 1970s home, then the family station wagon was its soul on wheels. Every family seemed to have one, a Ford Country Squire, a Chevy Caprice Estate, or maybe a Dodge Monaco with faux wood paneling that gleamed under the sun like polished furniture. The tailgate windows rolled down by hand. The back seat faced backward, and the air smelled of vinyl, gasoline, and crayons left to melt in the glove compartment. Road trips didn't start with GPS or playlists. They started with folding maps that never quite folded back the same way. Dad would spread one across the hood before leaving, tracing a route with his finger, red and blue lines connecting tiny towns with names you'd never heard of but would remember forever. Mom packed sandwiches wrapped in wax paper, a thermos of coffee, and a roll of paper towels that would somehow serve as napkins, tissues, and first aid. The moment the station wagon started, it felt like the world opened up. The 8-track clicked into place. Maybe the Eagles, maybe Fleetwood Mac, and the hum of the engine became a steady background note. No one was staring at screens. The scenery was the entertainment. You'd see billboards promising the world's largest ball of twine, gas stations with attendants in crisp uniforms, and endless stretches of open highway that seemed to shimmer under the heat. Kids claimed their spots early. Someone always called window seat before the engine even turned on. The middle seat was for the unlucky, the one stuck between siblings and arguments. But the real treasure was the far back seat, facing out the rear window, where you could wave at the cars behind you and make faces at truck drivers who'd honk in return. It was a moving clubhouse, a private world within the family's four wheels. The air conditioner, if you had one, barely worked, so windows stayed open, hair whipping in the wind. The sound of passing cars mixed with the rhythmic clack of tires hitting seams in the pavement. Thump, 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 like a metronome for the road. On long drives, you'd stop at roadside diners where waitresses called everyone Han and served pancakes bigger than the plates. The jukebox by the counter always played something soft, maybe Raindrops Keep Falling on My Head, or American Pie. Gas stations were their own kind of ritual. You'd roll down the window and say, "Fill her up, regular," and the attendant would lift the nozzle, wipe his hands on a rag, and ask how far you were headed. You could tell where you were in the country by the smell: coastal salt, mountain pine, desert dust, or fresh-cut grass from the Midwest. Inside the wagon, the ride was a balance of peace and chaos. Dad drove with one arm out the window, sunglasses on, humming to the radio. Mom passed snacks back without turning around, trusting muscle memory to land each sandwich safely. Kids argued about invisible borders on the seat cushions, drew fog pictures on the glass, and played I Spy until someone dozed off. Every so often, you'd hit a patch of silence, that rare kind where everyone was just there, watching the world roll by. Telephone poles ticking past like clock hands, the sky painted in layers of orange and pink as the day faded. Sometimes Dad would whistle quietly, or Mom would reach for his hand without saying a word. You didn't need much to feel content, just a tank of gas and the open road. At night, the headlights stretched into tunnels of gold, and the hum of the tires turned hypnotic. Kids in the back drifted to sleep, their faces glowing in the faint light from the dashboard. There was a strange comfort in that sound, the steady whir of motion, the occasional sigh from the engine, as if the car itself was alive, carrying everyone safely home. When you finally pulled into a motel for the night, neon vacancy signs buzzing, the smell of chlorine from the pool in the air, the car doors shut with heavy metallic thuds, the kind modern ones never quite capture. The day lingered on your skin, sunlight, dust, and freedom. The family station wagon wasn't just transportation. It was where stories were told, songs were learned, and time slowed down long enough to remember. You might forget the exact route or the names of the towns, but you never forget the feeling, windows down, wind in your hair, and the road stretching endlessly ahead. There was a kind of patience built into communication back in the 1970s, a rhythm that belonged to the sound of a rotary phone. You'd pick up that heavy receiver, its coiled cord twisting like a snake, and place your finger into one of the circular holes. Each number had its own little ritual: press, spin, release, wait for the wheel to glide back with that soft clicking sound. And if you misdialed, you started all over again. Nobody minded. Time moved differently then. Phones didn't sit in pockets or blink with endless notifications. They hung on kitchen walls, anchored by long cords that seemed to stretch across the entire house. You could always tell when someone was talking too long. The cord would be tangled into impossible knots, wrapping around the table leg or looping across the hallway. There was a rhythm to conversation that can't be replicated today. You didn't text, you talked. You listened for tone, for pauses, for laughter breaking through static. Sometimes those calls weren't private. In small towns and rural neighborhoods, party lines were still a thing. A single phone line shared by multiple families. You'd pick up the receiver, hear a faint click, and suddenly realize someone else was already on. "Sorry, Millie. Didn't mean to interrupt," someone would say, and you'd hang up politely, waiting your turn. But sometimes curiosity got the better of you. You'd quietly lift the receiver again, covering it with your hand, listening in for a second or two, just enough to catch a whisper of gossip about the neighbors or who got a new car. Phones weren't just tools. They were part of the home's identity. The sound of a ring echoed through the house, sharp and metallic. Not a tune, not a buzz, but a ring. And everyone moved when it happened. Someone shouted, "I got it," and there'd be a race to the wall before it stopped. The idea of letting a call go unanswered felt strange. Every ring could be a friend, a relative, or something important. You didn't know who was calling. There was no caller ID, no preview, no screen, just a voice waiting on the other end. That mystery was part of the charm. Conversations could last for hours. Teenagers sprawled on their beds, twirling the cord, tracing patterns into the carpet as they whispered about crushes, songs, and dreams. Parents talked to relatives across states, long-distance calls carefully timed because every minute counted. You'd hear someone in the living room say, "Better keep it short, it's long distance," and you'd know this was serious. Voices carried warmth through those lines. small hesitations, sighs, laughter, things that texts could never capture. Phones were also where big news broke. You'd hear a sharp intake of breath followed by, "You're kidding," or "When did it happen?" That same cord that stretched across the house somehow carried the whole world in it. Love, loss, excitement, and connection. You could tell when something mattered just by the tone of the silence that followed. And then there were the prank calls. Every kid tried it at least once, dialing a random number and asking, "Is your refrigerator running?" before hanging up in a fit of laughter. No one traced calls. No one took it too seriously. It was innocent, clumsy fun, the kind you could only get away with in a time when numbers were handwritten in address books and remembered by heart. Phone books themselves were part of the ritual, thick, yellowed, smelling faintly of ink and paper. They were everywhere, stacked under kitchen counters and next to the phone stand. Everyone's name, number, and sometimes even their job printed right there. If you needed a plumber, a pizza place, or a friend from high school, you flipped through it. No algorithms required. There was something grounding about that heavy receiver pressed to your ear, the warmth of another human voice, carried through copper wires stretched across miles. When you hung up, it wasn't just a button press. You placed the receiver down gently, and the sound of the cradle clicking shut felt final, almost ceremonial. The phone didn't own you. It waited for you. You could walk outside, mow the lawn, visit a neighbor, and never worry about missing a call. Life wasn't lived around the ring. It happened between them. And yet, every time I see an old rotary phone now, I feel that muscle memory return. The slow spin of the dial, the gentle hum in the receiver before the other voice answered. It wasn't instant, and that was the beauty of it. The space between rings was filled with life. If you close your eyes and picture the inside of a 1970s home, you can almost feel it, the soft give of shag carpet beneath your feet, the hum of a refrigerator the color of ripe avocado, and the faint buzz of fluorescent lights bouncing off wood-paneled walls. Everything in those homes had texture, warmth, and personality. There was nothing sterile or minimal about it. Life was bold, patterned, and unapologetically alive. The first thing people notice now, looking back, is the color. It was everywhere: golden yellows, burnt oranges, avocado greens, deep browns, and mustard tones. The palette was warm and earthy, like the whole decade was caught in a permanent sunset. You'd walk into a kitchen and see a refrigerator and oven both glowing in that soft green hue, a table with chrome legs surrounded by vinyl chairs, and wallpaper covered in repeating geometric shapes. It was cozy, yes, but it also felt alive, like every inch of the space had a story to tell. The shag carpet was its own phenomenon. Thick, plush, and defiant against practicality, it turned every living room into a lounge. You didn't just walk across it, you sank into it. It came in shades that ranged from copper to deep orange, sometimes even lime green, and it made vacuuming an Olympic event. But nobody minded. Kids would stretch out on the floor to watch TV or play board games, and the carpet became part of the family, collecting memories, crumbs, and maybe a few lost coins along the way. Furniture followed the same philosophy. Comfort first, convention second. Low, modular sofas wrapped in corduroy or velvet. Coffee tables made of smoked glass. Bean bags that swallowed you whole. There was something wonderfully unpretentious about it all. Homes didn't aim to impress, they aimed to welcome. Every living room had a record player or a stack of 8 tracks nearby, a houseplant hanging in a macrame holder, and a soft orange glow from a lamp with a tasseled shade. The kitchen, that was command central. It smelled of coffee, bacon grease, and pot roast simmering in a slow cooker. The counters were laminate, the cabinets dark wood, and somewhere on the fridge door were magnets from road trips or hand-drawn notes held up by souvenir clips. You could hear the rhythmic click of the oven timer or the ding of a toaster. Cooking wasn't about speed or convenience. It was about togetherness. Recipes were handwritten on index cards and passed between generations, some smudged with butter or sugar. Moms wore aprons with floral prints, dads carved roasts with electric knives, and kids waited eagerly for dessert. Maybe Jell-O salad, maybe pineapple upside-down cake, maybe something from the new box of instant pudding. Even the dishes had character. Thick, heavy plates with orange and brown flower patterns. Glass cups that clinked with every pour of Kool-Aid or sweet iced tea. The sound of dinner being served was a kind of comfort. The clatter of cutlery, the scrape of chairs on the linoleum floor, the faint murmur of the evening news from the living room. And then there were the smells. Every home had its own. Lemon-scented pledge, freshly brewed coffee, cinnamon from the oven, maybe a whiff of cigarette smoke that had seeped into the curtains. It wasn't just the decor that made the era unforgettable. It was the sensory world around it. You could feel the 1970s with every breath. Evenings often ended in the living room, where the light dimmed to a soft amber and the TV glowed from inside its wooden frame. The furniture arrangement told its own story. Chairs angled toward one another, not the screen, because conversation mattered. People talked, laughed, played cards, or flipped through National Geographic magazines stacked neatly on side tables. When the day slowed down, you might see Dad leaning back in his recliner, the sound of the evening news mixing with the faint hum of a ceiling fan. Mom would tidy the dishes. Kids would sprawl out on the shag carpet with coloring books or homework, and the entire home seemed to exhale together, a quiet, content sigh after another ordinary, beautiful day. Looking back now, those rooms might seem dated or loud by modern standards, but there was warmth in that chaos. Every inch of the home was alive with color, sound, and meaning. You didn't just live in your home, you lived with it. The avocado kitchens and shag carpets of the 1970s were more than a style. They were a reflection of a time when imperfection was beautiful, when comfort mattered more than aesthetics, and when a home truly felt like the center of the world. Evenings in the 1970s had a quiet kind of rhythm that started the moment the sun slipped below the rooftops. The day slowed, the light dimmed, and houses all over the neighborhood began to glow from the inside. The smell of dinner still lingered in the air. Pot roast, mashed potatoes, or maybe a frozen TV dinner still cooling on a metal tray. Dishes clinked in the sink. The dog settled in its corner, and somewhere in the background, the faint static hum of the television was coming to life. Back then, the TV wasn't background noise. It was an event. Families built their evenings around it. The television itself wasn't sleek or thin. It was furniture. A heavy wooden console with a curved glass screen and knobs that clicked with satisfying weight when you turned them. Some sets even had sliding wooden doors that you'd open like a treasure chest before settling in for the night. The glow of that screen filled the living room with a soft, flickering warmth, almost like a modern-day fireplace. There were no endless options, no streaming queues, no scrolling through thumbnails. You had a handful of channels, 3 or 4 if you were lucky. ABC, NBC, CBS, and maybe PBS if the antenna behaved. Sometimes you'd see the picture fade into static, and Dad would get up to adjust the rabbit ears wrapped in aluminum foil. A twist here, a nudge there, and suddenly Walter Cronkite's face would come back into focus, calm and steady as ever, reading the news of the day in that unmistakable voice that felt like truth itself. After the news, the real magic began. The living room became a shared theater. Families gathered close, kids lying on the shag carpet, parents on the sofa with a bowl of popcorn between them. The theme songs that played were more than jingles. They were part of life's soundtrack. The Mary Tyler Moore Show, Happy Days, All in the Family, MASH Asterisk, The Brady Bunch, The Jeffersons, each had its own rhythm, its own warmth, its own kind of laughter. When Archie Bunker argued in his worn armchair, or when Richie Cunningham smiled his way through another awkward teenage moment, everyone in America seemed to be watching together. There was comfort in that collective experience, knowing that millions of families were laughing at the same jokes at the same time in living rooms just like yours. The laughter that came from the TV mixed with the laughter that came from your own couch, and for a little while, the world outside disappeared. Commercials had their own charm. You didn't skip them, you watched them. Jingles for Coca-Cola, Alka-Seltzer, and Polaroid cameras got stuck in your head for weeks. "I'd like to buy the world a Coke" wasn't just a slogan. It was a little piece of pop poetry that made everyone feel connected. You saw familiar faces, smiling families, clean kitchens, and bright-eyed actors selling products that promised to make life just a bit easier, or at least a bit shinier. Saturday nights were special. That's when the TV lineup felt like a celebration. The Carol Burnett Show filled living rooms with sketches that made people laugh until they cried. Later came Saturday Night Live, a little wilder, a little edgier, but still bound by that same sense of togetherness. It didn't matter what kind of week you'd had. By the time the credits rolled, you felt lighter. And then, when the night grew late, the television signed off. There was no 24-hour broadcast, no looping programs to fall asleep to. The last image you'd see was often the American flag waving as the national anthem played, followed by a moment of silence, and then the screen faded to static. That soft, snowy hiss filled the room like white noise, a strange kind of lullaby signaling the end of another day. Someone would finally get up, twist the knob to turn it off, and the glow would fade into darkness. The house would grow quiet again. The only sounds left were the hum of the refrigerator, the ticking of a wall clock, maybe a car passing outside. Parents would head to bed, kids already dreaming, and the TV, that box of light and laughter, would rest until morning. Looking back now, that ritual feels almost sacred. It wasn't just about entertainment, it was about connection. Families didn't scroll side by side, they sat side by side. They shared reactions, emotions, laughter, and silence. The TV wasn't the center of attention, it was the backdrop to something more important, the feeling of being together. Those nights built memories stronger than any show's storyline. The smell of popcorn, the sound of that static, the soft flicker of the screen dancing on the faces you loved most. That was the real magic of the 1970s. It wasn't just what we watched, it was who we were when we watched it. If the 1970s had a pulse, you could hear it in the soft clunk of an 8-track cartridge sliding into the dashboard player. That sound, the faint mechanical click, the gentle hum before the music started, was the heartbeat of the decade. Cars didn't just move people, they carried sound. And that sound came from a plastic rectangle no bigger than your hand, filled with magnetic tape that somehow captured the feeling of an entire era. There was something ceremonial about it. You'd hold the cartridge in your hand, maybe a little scuffed, maybe with a strip of masking tape where someone had written Eagles, Greatest Hits, or Fleetwood Mac, Rumors. You'd push it in, feel the resistance, and then, click, the speakers would come alive. No skipping, no playlists, no shuffle button, just whatever came next. The 8-track divided each album into 4 programs, and when one finished, the player would switch automatically with a heavy, satisfying ka-chunk. If you were in the middle of your favorite song when it changed programs, tough luck. You'd just wait for it to come around again. It wasn't perfect technology, but that was part of its charm. The hiss of the tape, the faint warble of sound when it got warm, all of it felt alive. The music wasn't sterile, it breathed. You could hear the imperfections, the tiny mechanical noises that made it real. The car became a moving concert hall, a private sanctuary where voices like Elton John, Stevie Nicks, and Don Henley filled the air like ghosts of radio waves. Long drives were never silent. You'd hear Hotel California stretch out across endless miles of highway, or Dreams echo softly against the hum of the engine. The windows would be rolled down, the air rushing in, and the music mixed with the sound of the wind until you couldn't tell one from the other. When you hit a red light, you'd see other cars beside you, their drivers drumming fingers on the steering wheel, mouthing lyrics you both knew by heart. For a moment, strangers were connected by invisible harmonies flowing from dashboard speakers across America. The home versions weren't much different. Big, boxy players that sat on wooden shelves next to stacks of records and heavy speakers that made the walls vibrate. People didn't stream songs, they collected them. The shelf of 8 tracks was like a gallery of identity. You could tell a lot about someone from their collection. The kind of person who had Led Zeppelin and Pink Floyd was different from the one who had ABBA and Barry Manilow. But everyone, in their own way, used music to shape the atmosphere of their life. Friends would come over with a few new tapes tucked under their arms, and swapping them was an unspoken ritual. "You gotta hear this one," someone would say, and the next few hours were spent sprawled on the floor, half talking, half listening. Music wasn't background, it was the mood itself. It filled every gap in conversation, every quiet moment in the car, every long evening after dinner. Even the 8-track players themselves had personality. They'd sometimes eat the tape, pulling the ribbon out in a tangled mess. But people didn't panic. They fixed it with a pencil and a steady hand, winding it back like surgeons performing delicate work. There was patience in that act, a kind of respect for the music. You didn't throw things away, you made them work again. The sound of the 1970s was physical, tangible, warm, imperfect. The 8-track didn't just play songs, it demanded presence. You listened. You felt the bass under your ribs, the treble vibrating through the steering wheel. When the track switched mid-chorus, you didn't sigh. You laughed, tapped your fingers, and waited. Life had pauses, and so did the music. Looking back now, it feels like more than just a piece of technology. It was a symbol of freedom, the soundtrack of backroads, summer nights, and quiet moments when the world felt infinite. That chunky plastic cartridge carried more than tape. It carried time. Every scratch, every hiss, every mechanical click was proof that you were there, that you were living inside the music. And when the song ended, you didn't skip forward or start over. You just let the silence hang for a second, the engine idling, the road stretching ahead, the last notes of the 70s fading softly into the wind. Disco didn't just appear, it erupted. One day, radios were filled with folk and soft rock, and the next, everything shimmered with rhythm and light. It was the sound of escape, of motion, of a world that wanted to dance its worries away. The early 70s were heavy with oil crises, politics, and social change, but when the beat hit, none of that mattered. For a few hours every night, people just wanted to move. The heart of disco was the dance floor. Wooden, glowing, alive. Lights flashing from beneath your feet, colored beams bouncing off a spinning mirror ball that turned every face into a kaleidoscope of reflected stars. The air inside those clubs was thick. Perfume, cigarette smoke, and the faint sweetness of spilled cocktails mixing with sweat and excitement. The sound system didn't whisper, it thumped. Every bass line felt like it was pulsing through your ribs. And when the needle dropped on Staying Alive or I Will Survive, the entire room moved like one body. It started in small clubs, mostly underground, in places like New York's Loft or the Sanctuary, spaces built by people who didn't fit into the mainstream but found belonging under colored lights. The music was born out of diversity, Black, Latin, and gay communities blending soul, funk, and rhythm into something brand new. DJs like David Mancuso and Larry Levon turned record players into instruments, mixing songs into endless streams of energy. It wasn't about the artist anymore. It was about the moment. Then, of course, came Studio 54, the glittering temple of excess. Lines stretched around the block, sequins and velvet shining under the streetlights. Celebrities brushed shoulders with everyday dreamers, all equal under the disco ball. The night might start with Donna Summer, slide into the Bee Gees, and end with a sweaty chorus of Le Freak by Chic. People didn't just dance, they performed. Every gesture was theatrical, every outfit a statement. Polyester shimmered under strobes, gold chains swung with every move, and platforms clicked in rhythm like instruments of their own. For many, disco was freedom. It was the sound of people reclaiming joy in a decade that sometimes felt too serious. The Vietnam War had ended, but the world was still figuring out what came next. Gas lines, inflation, uncertainty. All of it melted the moment a DJ turned the volume up and the crowd erupted. It was rebellion through rhythm, not against authority, but against gloom. Outside the clubs, disco seeped into everything. The radio played Boogie Wonderland, while grocery store speakers quietly hummed More Than a Woman. Fashion followed the beat, shiny fabrics, open collars, big hair, glitter everywhere. Even small-town roller rinks became mini disco halls, their lights flickering over spinning wheels and laughter. You didn't need New York City to feel it. You just needed a song and space to move. Then came Saturday Night Fever. John Travolta in that white suit, pointing toward the sky, the pose that defined a generation. The film wasn't just entertainment, it was an anthem. Suddenly, everyone wanted to dance like Tony Manero. Soundtracks sold by the millions, disco balls appeared in high school gyms, and even shy suburban dads found themselves tapping a foot to the beat. The Bee Gees became more than a band. They became the sound of the decade. But disco wasn't just for the elite or the young. Weddings, birthdays, and bar mitzvahs. Every celebration turned into a miniature nightclub. Songs like Dancing Queen and You Should Be Dancing brought people of all ages onto the floor. It didn't matter if you were good or not. Disco was about the feeling, not the form. Some critics dismissed it as shallow, but they missed the point. Disco wasn't trying to change the world with words, it changed it with movement. It turned strangers into friends and rhythm into unity. Beneath the glitter and the glamour was something deeply human, a need to belong, to feel seen, to forget everything for 3 minutes and just dance. The night always ended the same way. Sweat on your skin, the faint buzz in your ears from the speakers, the disco ball slowing to a stop as the last record played. People would spill into the streets under the yellow glow of city lights, laughing, exhausted, their hearts still pounding to an invisible beat. The music lingered long after the doors closed, echoing through the city, through time itself. Disco wasn't just a genre, it was a heartbeat, a shimmering, defiant reminder that even in uncertain times, the world could still be beautiful, as long as the music kept playing. While disco spun under mirrored lights in city clubs, another kind of electricity was moving through the veins of the 1970s, loud, raw, and defiant. Rock music wasn't just alive, it was ruling the earth. Stadiums filled with cigarette smoke and the smell of beer became temples, and guitars became the instruments of something close to religion. If disco was the sound of escape, rock was the sound of confrontation, of the world as it was, unfiltered and untamed. Bands didn't whisper feelings, they screamed them into amplifiers the size of refrigerators. You could feel it in your bones, the growl of a Marshall stack, the thunder of drums rolling through the ground, and the chorus of thousands of fans chanting lyrics in perfect, passionate unison. The 70s belonged to the giants: Led Zeppelin, the Rolling Stones, Pink Floyd, Queen, Fleetwood Mac, Aerosmith, and The Who. Each one carried its own universe. Zeppelin blended mysticism with muscle, guitars slicing through the air like lightning. The Stones swaggered through the decade, their riffs soaked in rebellion and blues. Pink Floyd built entire worlds in sound, slow, meditative, cosmic. Their music didn't just play, it expanded. You'd sit in a dark room with headphones on, time echoing in your ears, and for a few minutes you felt weightless. Concerts were more than shows, they were pilgrimages. People traveled miles, camping overnight for tickets that sold for $10 and meant everything. The lights would dim, the crowd would erupt, and the first chord would send shivers through every body in the arena. Smoke hung in the air, not just from machines, but from the crowd itself. Lighters flickered like tiny stars. You could feel the floor trembling as the drums kicked in, and for a few hours, nothing else in the world mattered. Fleetwood Mac brought a different kind of magic. Harmonies laced with heartbreak, lyrics that sounded like private conversations turned into poetry. Go Your Own Way, Dreams, The Chain. They weren't just songs. They were emotional blueprints for a generation learning to love, lose, and keep moving. And then there was Queen, theatrical, fearless, impossible to imitate. Freddie Mercury didn't just sing, he commanded. Bohemian Rhapsody wasn't a song, it was an odyssey: piano, opera, guitar solos, and thunder all in one. Radio was how the world stayed connected to that sound. DJs became cultural guides, introducing new anthems to millions. You'd sit by the radio, waiting for your favorite song to come on, fingers hovering over the record button on your cassette deck. There was always static, always a little imperfection, but that only made it feel more alive. Smoke on the Water, Hotel California, more than a feeling. Each one turned the car into a moving concert hall. Rock had layers, too. Beneath the loud guitars, there was folk rock, the softer heartbeat of the decade. Artists like James Taylor, Carole King, and Crosby Stills and Nash brought introspection to the forefront. Acoustic guitars, gentle harmonies, songs that felt like letters written to the soul. They made quiet sound powerful. By the mid-70s, rock began to fracture: glam, progressive, southern, hard. David Bowie painted his face and stepped on his stages as Ziggy Stardust, blurring the line between gender, theater, and sound. Leonard Skinner's guitars carried the heat of the South, and in smoky bars, bands like AC/DC were building their own thunder, stripped down, unapologetic, made to wake the dead. Rock wasn't just heard, it was worn. Denim jackets covered in patches, long hair whipping in the wind, band tees that became uniforms. The concert ticket stubs tucked into wallets weren't souvenirs, they were badges of identity. You didn't just like rock, you belonged to it. It was how you understood yourself in a world that was changing too fast. For some, the music was rebellion. For others, it was therapy. But for everyone, it was connection, the invisible thread that tied a generation together. Late at night, after the show ended, you'd lie in bed with your ears still ringing, hearing echoes of the crowd in your mind. That was the thing about rock in the 70s. It didn't leave you when the lights came on. It stayed in your bones, humming there quietly, long after the last chord faded. Looking back, it's hard to separate memory from melody. Every great riff feels like a place you've been, every lyric like something you once lived. The 70s were loud, messy, and glorious, and rock music was its heartbeat, pounding, relentless, and unforgettable. Before the internet, before playlists and streaming, before shuffle was even a word you could press, there was the radio, and the voices that came through it were as familiar as family. Every town had its own soundtrack, shaped not by algorithms, but by the hands of a DJ spinning vinyl behind a glass booth that smelled faintly of dust and cigarette smoke. The radio wasn't background noise, it was the pulse of daily life. The morning commute began with that warm, slightly fuzzy voice over AM frequencies, cutting through static to tell you the headlines, the weather, and what song would carry you into the day. The DJ didn't just play music, he introduced it, building anticipation before the needle even touched the groove. And up next, he'd say, "We've got a brand new one from Fleetwood Mac. This one's climbing fast." Then a crackle, a pause, and suddenly the car was filled with sound. Not compressed, not curated, but alive. By afternoon, the energy changed. Teenagers rushed home from school, dropping their books just in time to catch Casey Kasem's American Top 40. His voice was smooth as honey, counting down the biggest hits in the country, song by song, with stories about the artists in between. You learned things there, where Elton John recorded, what inspired Hotel California, who the Eagles wrote about. It was part education, part escape, and all magic. Recording songs off the radio was an art form of its own. You'd sit beside the stereo, finger hovering over the record and play buttons, ready to catch your favorite tune the moment it started. Timing was everything. Too early, and you'd record the DJ's intro. Too late, and you'd miss the first few notes. When the song finally played through, you'd lean back and smile, satisfied that you'd captured it. Even if someone's voice faded in at the end saying, "That was Chicago, right here on WABC." That's how mixtapes were born. Not perfectly edited, not cleanly cut, just raw love for sound, captured in plastic. Every mixtape told a story. Maybe it was for a crush, carefully arranged so the lyrics said what you couldn't. Maybe it was for a long drive, songs chosen for the rhythm of the road. Or maybe it was just for yourself, a sonic diary of who you were that month, that year, that moment in your life. You'd label it in ballpoint pen, Summer 77 mix, late nights, songs for thinking, and every time you pressed play, you'd return to that version of yourself. The DJs understood that power. They weren't faceless broadcasters, they were companions. They spoke in a way that made you feel like they were talking just to you. When they said, "Good night out there," you believed they meant it. You trusted them with your emotions, with heartbreak songs after a breakup, with sing-alongs on Friday nights, with quiet tracks that made long drives feel cinematic. Late-night radio was different, slower, more intimate. The lights in the booth dimmed, the tones softened, and the songs got deeper. You'd hear "Babe" by Styx or "If You Leave Me Now" by Chicago, drifting through the darkness as headlights flickered down empty highways. For insomniacs, truck drivers, or lonely souls sitting by a window, that voice between songs felt like a friend in the quiet. And then there were the call-ins, people dedicating songs to someone they loved or someone they missed. "This one goes out to Mary in Tallahassee," the DJ would say, "from someone who wants her to know he's sorry." Then the music would start, and across miles of static and distance, the message would find its way. The radio turned emotions into frequencies, carrying them invisibly through the air until they reached the right pair of ears. It's hard to describe now, that feeling of not knowing what song would come next, but trusting it would be something good. You couldn't skip. You couldn't replay. You just listened. And somehow, that made every moment matter more. When I think of the radio now, I remember the glow of the dial at night, that soft orange light sliding between numbers as you searched for the clearest signal, the hum of the speakers, the voice fading in and out, and the moment when the static finally gave way to music that felt like it had been waiting just for you. It wasn't perfect. Sometimes the station drifted. Sometimes the tape jammed. But it was real. And in a world that's become too polished, too instant, that imperfection feels like something we've lost, that little bit of mystery between the songs, where life itself seemed to hum. The DJs are mostly gone now, replaced by screens and algorithms, but their voices still echo somewhere in memory, steady, warm, human. They didn't just play the music. They taught us how to love it. By the late 70s, when disco glittered and rock filled arenas, a new sound began clawing its way out of the underground, raw, stripped down, and furious. It wasn't polished, it wasn't pretty, and it didn't care to be. Punk was born from frustration, a rebellion against everything that felt too perfect, too corporate, too fake. It didn't come from record labels or polished studios. It came from basements, garages, and sweat-soaked clubs where the stage was barely a foot off the ground. It started as a rumble in the backstreets of New York City. CBGB became the unlikely epicenter, a grimy bar with walls covered in graffiti and ceilings dripping with old beer. You could walk in on any night and see the Ramones hammering out 2-minute songs that sounded like a car crash you couldn't stop watching. They played fast, hard, and loud. No solos, no frills, no pretension. Just power chords, attitude, and a beat that hit like a fist to the chest. Across the Atlantic, something similar was happening. In London, the Sex Pistols were tearing through the polite quiet of British rock, sneering into microphones with songs like Anarchy in the UK and God Save the Queen. They weren't just playing music, they were spitting back at the system. Their concerts felt dangerous, unpredictable, like the floor might give out or the crowd might explode. For a generation tired of being told what to like, Punk was permission to stop caring and start shouting. The Clash gave punk its conscience. Furious but poetic, political but human. London Calling wasn't just a song. It was a warning flare fired into the night sky. The guitars buzzed, the drums charged forward like a heartbeat, and the lyrics were written like manifestos. Where disco shimmered and rock soared, punk burned, quick, bright, and unapologetic. The clothes told the story just as much as the music. Torn shirts, safety pins, leather jackets covered in patches, and hair dyed in impossible colors. It wasn't fashion, it was armor. A way of saying, I don't belong to your world. Kids who couldn't afford designer clothes turned poverty into style. Ripped jeans weren't rebellion for sale. They were what you wore because you had nothing else. And somehow, that honesty became iconic. Punk wasn't about being a musician. It was about doing. Anyone could grab a guitar, bang out 3 chords, and scream about what mattered to them. That was the beauty of it. The barrier between performer and listener disappeared. A fan one week could be on stage the next. It was democratic, chaotic, and alive. In the U.S., the movement spread like wildfire, from New York to Los Angeles, where bands like Black Flag and the Germs pushed punk into darker, faster territories. The shows were brutal, bodies colliding, sweat flying, feedback screaming. There was danger, yes, but also a strange kind of unity. The mosh pit wasn't violence, it was release. It was all that pent-up frustration, loneliness, and energy turned into something human. The mainstream didn't know what to do with it. Critics dismissed it. Radio ignored it. But punk didn't care. It didn't want approval. It lived off the margins. Zines were photocopied in bedrooms and passed around at shows. Flyers were handwritten and taped to telephone poles. Every band was a world unto itself. Every fan part of something bigger than themselves. A movement without rules. And yet, beneath all the noise, punk had heart. It wasn't just rage, it was honesty. Songs like Blitzkrieg Bop, White Riot, or Should I Stay or Should I Go weren't about destruction. They were about being seen. For every broken amp and shouted lyric, there was a pulse of hope. That music could still belong to people, not corporations. That art didn't have to be perfect to be powerful. By the end of the decade, punk had already begun to evolve. The raw sound splintered. New wave, post-punk, hardcore. Bands like Talking Heads and Blondie carried pieces of it into something more experimental. But that first explosion, those first few years of noise and fury, left a mark that never faded. Punk didn't last because it never had to. It wasn't about endurance. It was about impact. When you listen to those recordings now, the hiss of the tape, the distortion swallowing the singer's voice, you can still feel it. The sweat, the danger, the youth. The sense that someone, somewhere, had finally decided to stop waiting for permission to make noise. Punk wasn't about rebellion for rebellion's sake. It was a reminder that sometimes, to feel alive, you have to tear things down. And even in its chaos, there was beauty, the kind that only comes from truth screamed through a broken microphone, under flickering lights, to a crowd that finally felt seen. If the 70s had a shape, it flared at the bottom. Bell-bottoms didn't just define fashion, they defined movement. Every step felt like a small performance, fabric swaying like a rhythm in sync with the music of the decade. They weren't just pants, they were a declaration. Loose, bold, and full of personality. You could see them everywhere, in high schools, roller rinks, record stores, and discos. Denim, corduroy, polyester, it didn't matter. What mattered was the flare, the way it caught the light and moved with confidence. The tighter they fit around the thighs, the more dramatic the flare at the ankle. The sound of them brushing together became part of the background noise of the era, soft, steady, and unmistakable. It wasn't only about style. It was about identity. The 60s had been about rebellion. The 70s were about expression. And nothing expressed that more than a good pair of bell-bottoms paired with platform shoes that could add 10 centimeters to your height and twice that to your confidence. Platform soles, thick, heavy, and outrageous, made people taller, louder, bolder. You could hear them before you saw them, that confident thud on the pavement or the dance floor. Even the most ordinary person could feel like a rock star just by slipping them on. They turned sidewalks into runways, grocery aisles into stages. Men wore them. Women wore them. Teenagers lived in them. Elton John had entire closets full of glittering, custom-made pairs. David Bowie wore them like armor. And regular folks followed, painting theirs, sewing patches, or adding rhinestones until each pair told its own story. Shopping for clothes in the 70s was an experience, part adventure, part ritual. Malls were growing, boutiques were booming, and fashion wasn't just something you saw in magazines. It was hanging right there, under fluorescent lights and Motown music playing through the store speakers. You'd flip through racks of bell-bottoms, trying to find the perfect fit, the right color, the pair that made you feel like you belonged to the moment. Jeans had become more than workwear. They were rebellion turned mainstream. Levi's and Wrangler were still around, but now there were custom designs, embroidery, and beads. People personalized everything. You might have peace signs stitched onto the pockets, or a hand-painted flower curling around the leg. There was something handmade about the whole decade, a mix of mass production and personal touch, of culture meeting craft. Platform shoes came in every possible form: suede, leather, vinyl, even clear plastic filled with glitter or tiny floating stars. They were loud in every sense of the word. Some people slipped on modest 2-inch soles, while others dared to climb into 6-inch monsters that turned every dance move into a balancing act. The risk of a twisted ankle didn't matter. The higher you stood, the freer you felt. You'd see groups of teenagers walking down the street, the sun bouncing off their mirrored sunglasses, jeans swaying, shoes pounding to the rhythm of the music blasting from a passing car. The world felt colorful again after the grays and browns of the late 60s. People wanted to be seen, and not just seen, but remembered. There was also something communal about it. You didn't just dress for yourself. You dressed for the energy around you. If the music was loud, the clothes followed. When you went to a party, everyone looked like they'd stepped out of a record sleeve. The mix of textures was intoxicating: velvet jackets, silk shirts, denim vests, and, of course, the shoes that could make or break your night. When the disco scene exploded, those platform soles became mandatory. You couldn't spin under a mirror ball without them. The lights from above would catch the silver buckles, the shiny patent leather, the glitter dusted across the toes. And as the bass hit, those flared legs swayed in time, every beat marked by the sound of shoes meeting floor. Looking back, it's hard not to smile at how impractical it all was. But that was the point. Fashion wasn't supposed to be sensible. It was supposed to be alive. The people who wore those towering shoes and bell-shaped jeans weren't chasing comfort. They were chasing joy. They were saying, "We've made it through the chaos of the 60s, and now we want to shine." Today, when you see a pair of bell-bottoms come back on a runway or a thrift store rack, it's like hearing the faint echo of that decade's heartbeat. You can almost hear the thump of those platforms on the pavement and the laughter of friends strutting down the street like a slow-motion parade. Bell-bottoms and platforms weren't just fashion, they were freedom stitched and molded into form. A reminder that sometimes the simplest way to lift your spirit is to literally lift yourself off the ground. If the 1970s could be described by a single fabric, it would be polyester. Smooth, shiny, and impossible to wrinkle. It was the miracle material of the future, the fabric that promised to outlast everything, even time itself. When you walked into a department store back then, the air almost buzzed with static electricity from all the polyester hanging in neat, colorful rows. It was everywhere: shirts, suits, dresses, curtains, even bedspreads. It wasn't just a trend, it was a statement. Polyester said you were modern, that you believed in progress, in science, in the promise of new technology that could make life easier, and maybe even a little flashier. Gone were the heavy wools and stiff cottons of the previous decades. This was the age of synthetic glamour. The fabric shimmered under light, caught the glow of disco balls, and somehow looked different every time you moved. You could hear it too. The faint rustle when someone walked by in a polyester suit, that smooth swish that followed you through the hallway or down the street. It reflected light and sound the way the whole decade did. Bold, confident, and unapologetically artificial. And yet, there was something deeply human about the way people loved it. Men's fashion exploded with it. The three-piece suit got an upgrade: wide lapels, bold prints, and colors no one had dared to wear before. Burnt orange, mustard yellow, lime green, maroon. Shirts with pointed collars stretched nearly to the shoulders, tucked neatly into flared trousers that could blind you with their sheen under sunlight. Every salesman, every dad at a neighborhood barbecue, every TV game show host seemed to be wearing one, and they wore it proudly. Women's fashion followed with equal flair. Polyester wrap dresses, jumpsuits, and blouses that draped just enough to move when you danced. Patterns were psychedelic: swirls, stripes, geometric shapes, like the 70s had decided the world should never look dull again. The dresses clung to the body but moved with it, perfect for the dance floor or a dinner party. And because polyester didn't wrinkle, you could throw it in the wash, hang it up, and wear it again in an hour. No ironing, no fuss, just ready for another night out. For many families, polyester represented accessibility. It made fashion democratic. You didn't need to be rich to look stylish. Sears catalogs, J.C. Penney, and Montgomery Ward all offered entire pages of polyester outfits, modeled by smiling families who looked like they were living in a commercial. The prices were low, the colors bright, and the message simple: anyone could look modern. Still, there was a divide. For all its popularity, polyester had its critics. Some said it didn't breathe, that it trapped heat, that after a long night of dancing, you could practically feel the fabric sticking to your skin. But that didn't stop anyone. The look was worth the discomfort. The 70s weren't about subtlety, they were about shine. And polyester shined. Walking into a disco in 1977 felt like stepping into a kaleidoscope. Under the flashing lights, every polyester outfit turned into liquid color. Men's shirts half unbuttoned, gold chains glinting, women's dresses flowing, catching the pulse of the bass line. Even the air seemed to shimmer. No other fabric in history has ever reflected music quite like polyester. And when the night ended, the same people who shimmered under disco lights went home, hung their clothes neatly, and wore them again the next day. The fabric was indestructible. It didn't fade, didn't tear, didn't age. A polyester shirt could survive 100 washes and look exactly the same. For a generation that believed in innovation, that durability felt like victory. But polyester was more than convenience. It was an emblem of optimism. The world was changing fast. Space exploration, microwaves, color television. Technology was everywhere, and polyester felt like part of that future. It was the textile version of the American dream. Affordable, modern, and always ready to shine. Even now, when you see those old photos, families in matching outfits, laughing beside wood-paneled walls, the sheen of polyester catches the eye first. It gleams under flash photography, defying age, as if the 70s refused to fade entirely. Sure, it wasn't perfect. It was synthetic, clingy, and sometimes a little too shiny. But that's what made it real to the people who lived through it. It wasn't about luxury. It was about joy. It was about feeling a little bit glamorous on an ordinary day. About dressing for the version of yourself you wanted to be, confident, colorful, alive. The 70s loved polyester because it mirrored the decade itself. Bold, optimistic, flawed, but unforgettable. And maybe that's why, even decades later, it still finds its way back into fashion shows and vintage stores. It never really died. It just waited patiently, wrinkle-free, for the next spotlight to hit. Hair in the 1970s wasn't just hair. It was identity, rebellion, confidence, and freedom all wrapped around the same strand. It told people who you were before you ever said a word. It framed the decade the way bell-bottoms framed the body, expressive, bold, and full of movement. After the strict styles of the 50s and the polished neatness of the early 60s, the 70s arrived with a shrug that said, "Let it be." Natural texture, volume, and individuality took over. Hair grew longer, fuller, looser, a rebellion against control itself. For the first time, people weren't chasing uniformity, they were chasing personality. For women, the decade belonged to the blowout. Farrah Fawcett's feathered layers defined beauty for millions. That cascade of golden waves, flipping perfectly outward at the ends, looked effortless. Though every woman who tried it knew it took a can of hairspray and a prayer. Farrah's look wasn't just a style, it was a cultural earthquake. You'd see women leaving salons with rollers still in their hair, praying their blow dryers at home would achieve that same perfect lift and bounce. Then there was Cher, sleek, straight, and impossibly long. Her hair became a statement of elegance and independence. The way it caught the light on television, glossy and dark, made simplicity suddenly powerful again. Women everywhere began to iron their hair flat, using real clothing irons on kitchen tables before straighteners even existed. The results were uneven, sometimes disastrous, but no one cared, because having that look meant something. It meant modern, fearless, cool. Men, too, found liberation in length. Gone were the clean cuts of the Eisenhower era. Now, hairbrushed shoulders, curled at the edges, and framed faces with a soft kind of defiance. Rock stars led the charge. Robert Plant's golden mane, Mick Jagger's shag, and David Bowie's ever-changing kaleidoscope of color and character. Bowie's bright red Ziggy Stardust mullet felt like a broadcast from another planet, half rebellion, half art. It gave permission for everyone else to be a little stranger, a little louder, a little more themselves. Afros became one of the most powerful cultural symbols of the entire decade. They weren't just a hairstyle, they were a movement. In the wake of the civil rights era, Black men and women embraced natural hair as an act of pride and defiance. The afro said, "This is who we are, unfiltered, unapologetic." It filled rooms with volume and power. It was beauty that refused to conform, beauty that demanded to be seen. Pam Grier's glorious halo of curls on movie posters, Angela Davis standing tall with her unmistakable silhouette. Those images burned into history. Hair care became ritual. Barbershops and beauty salons were community hubs, places where gossip, music, and laughter mixed with the smell of shampoo and hairspray. Blow dryers roared, curling irons hissed, and mirrors reflected people becoming the version of themselves they wanted to show the world. Even at home, hair took time. Rollers, pins, combs, and hours in front of the mirror, all part of the process. Saturday mornings often started with the smell of hair products drifting through the house and ended with the faint ache of bobby pins behind your ears. Kids and teens had their own takes. Messy bangs, middle parts, and shaggy cuts that looked like they'd been made by a friend with kitchen scissors. And sometimes they had. The shag, haircut itself became iconic. Layers upon layers that gave hair a wild, untamed texture. It looked natural, but it was carefully crafted chaos, a rebellion against the perfect curls of earlier decades. Every movement had its mirror in hair. Feminism brought shorter, practical cuts that said women didn't need to spend hours pleasing anyone's expectations. The glam rock scene answered with glitter sprayed into roots and colors no one had ever dared to wear. Neon blue, hot pink, silver. Even punk, arriving late in the decade, turned hair into a weapon. Mohawks, spikes, and dyes that screamed from across the room. Hair, in all its forms, carried the sound of the 70s, a mix of chaos and confidence, of softness and edge. You'd see it blowing out car windows on highways, catching strobe lights on dance floors, or shining under sun at summer concerts. And every strand told a story about the kind of person who wore it. Looking back now, those styles might seem excessive, too big, too shiny, too dramatic. But that was the beauty of it. The 70s weren't about blending in. They were about being seen. Hair was freedom, and freedom never goes out of style. Whether it was feathered, straightened, permed, or picked into a perfect halo, it captured something that no other decade quite managed. The feeling that self-expression could begin at the roots and end with the wind in your hair. If bell-bottoms were the legs of the 70s and feathered hair its crown, then sunglasses and denim jackets were its armor, the unofficial uniform of cool. Together, they carried an effortless kind of confidence, the kind that didn't shout but simply existed. You didn't have to be a movie star to look like one. You just needed a pair of oversized shades and a jacket that had lived a little. Denim was more than fabric. It was a philosophy. It didn't care about class or age. It belonged to everyone. The more you wore it, the better it looked, softening at the elbows, fading at the seams, shaping itself around the person you were becoming. In a decade obsessed with individuality, denim became a blank canvas. People personalized their jackets with embroidered patches, peace symbols, and hand-drawn doodles. Every tear and every stain told a story. Road trips, concerts, heartbreaks, and endless summers spent sitting on curbs with friends, talking about nothing and everything. The classic denim jacket, blue, sturdy, and slightly faded, had been around since the 50s, but in the 70s it reached icon status. It wasn't confined to cowboys or mechanics anymore. It belonged to everyone from Mick Jagger to the kid next door. It layered perfectly over everything: floral dresses, band tees, turtlenecks, or nothing but skin and a pendant. It looked equally at home in a dive bar or under a disco ball. You could throw it on in the morning, tie it around your waist in the afternoon, and drape it over someone's shoulders on a cool night. Levi's ruled the scene. Of course, that little red tag stitched into the seam became a quiet badge of authenticity. But the beauty of the denim jacket was that it didn't need to be new. In fact, the older it looked, the better. People traded them, borrowed them, wore them until the cuffs frayed and the buttons loosened. A good jacket could last a decade, and by the end, it didn't just fit your body, it fit your life. And then there were the sunglasses, the most glamorous disguise of the decade. Oversized frames dominated everything. The bigger, the better. They weren't just about sun protection, they were about mystery. They turned every face into a story you wanted to know more about. You'd see them everywhere: on beaches, behind steering wheels, inside diners, and even under dim lights at nightclubs. A good pair of shades said you belonged somewhere, even if you didn't know exactly where yet. Aviators were the eternal favorite: thin metal frames, tinted lenses that caught the light just enough to make you look untouchable. Thanks to movies like Easy Rider and shows like Starsky and Hutch, they became symbols of independence and rebellion. Then came the square frames, the gradient lenses, the ones that looked like they could cover half your face and still not be big enough. Jackie Onassis made them timeless, her oversized sunglasses turning into a statement that said elegance didn't need words. Each pair had its own personality. The mirrored lenses reflected the world back at itself, a little distorted, a little dreamlike. Amber-tinted ones made every day look like golden hour. Some were round, channeling John Lennon's calm idealism. Others were angular, dramatic, like something straight off a Vogue cover. But no matter the shape, they all had one thing in common: they gave you confidence. You could hide behind them, or you could use them to show the world exactly who you were trying to be. The combination of denim and sunglasses created an energy that felt effortlessly cool. Picture it: a group of friends leaning against their cars at sunset, radio playing Fleetwood Mac, denim jackets catching the last glow of the day, and mirrored aviators reflecting the fading sky. There was no pretense, just presence. A quiet understanding that looking good wasn't about being perfect. It was about attitude, and the 70s had plenty of that. Even today, when you see an old photograph from that decade, a young man with shaggy hair and Ray-Bans, or a woman in a faded jacket with her collar popped just so, it still radiates something. A kind of authenticity that can't be replicated by filters or branding. The clothes weren't trying to sell an image, they were the image. Maybe that's why the look never really left. Decades later, you can still walk into any city and find someone wearing the same uniform: denim jacket, sunglasses, confidence. The cuts may change, the music may evolve, but the spirit remains the same. Because deep down, everyone still wants to feel that simple, effortless cool the 70s mastered. The kind that didn't need words or logos, just a pair of shades and a jacket that had seen a few things. The denim jacket and the sunglasses weren't fashion accessories. They were invitations to adventure, to rebellion, to memory. They said, "I'm here and I'm free." And in a decade built on self-expression, that was the most stylish thing anyone could ever say. Fashion in the 70s didn't come from magazines alone. It came from the screen. Television and rock music didn't just reflect the culture, they created it. For the first time in history, What you wore could be inspired by a character you watched every week or a singer you saw under bright concert lights. The line between celebrity and everyday life blurred, and the living room became the front row of fashion's biggest stage. Every TV show seemed to leave its mark on how people dressed. The Sonny and Cher comedy hour set the tone for glamour. Cher with her long, sleek hair, dramatic lashes, and gowns that shimmered like liquid gold under the studio lights. She made daring look divine. Her outfits pushed boundaries, plunging necklines, feathers, sequins, all paired with a sense of humor that said, "I know you're staring, and that's the point." People didn't just watch her, they copied her. Stores couldn't keep up with the demand for flared pants and jeweled tops that looked remotely Cher-like. Then there was Charlie's Angels. Three women, three different styles, all powerful in their own way. Farrah Fawcett, with that sunlit California smile and her iconic feathered hair, made athleticism look glamorous. Kate Jackson and Jaclyn Smith brought sophistication and edge. They fought crime in bell-bottom jumpsuits and heels, showing the world that femininity and strength didn't cancel each other out. Overnight, women began tying their blouses, cinching their waists, and strutting down sidewalks like they were about to foil a secret mission. Television was the new runway, and shows like the Mary Tyler Moore Show changed how women dressed for work. Mary Richards tossed her hat in the air and reminded a generation that independence could look polished, not masculine. Her wardrobe, tailored blazers, A-line skirts, soft sweaters, became a new template for professional women finding their voice in a changing world. It wasn't just about looking good. It was about being taken seriously while looking good. For men, television gave permission to loosen up. Shows like Starsky and Hutch and Magnum, PI turned rugged masculinity into style. The unbuttoned shirts, the gold chains, the mustaches, they all spoke of confidence, of men who worked hard but didn't take themselves too seriously. The 70s man could be tough and stylish. It was a new kind of cool. But while TV influenced daily life, rock stars shaped the dream life. The stage was where fashion became myth. When David Bowie appeared as Ziggy Stardust, his face painted with a lightning bolt, platform boots glittering, jumpsuit clinging like armor, he redefined what clothing could say. It wasn't just costume, it was communication. Bowie blurred gender, art, and identity into one shimmering statement. Kids who saw him didn't just see a performer. They saw permission to be whoever they wanted to be. Mick Jagger turned androgyny into swagger. His silk shirts, scarves, and tight pants made masculinity fluid, playful, and magnetic. Freddie Mercury wore skin-tight satin one night and a regal cape the next, his fashion as theatrical as his voice. Elton John, with his outrageous glasses and rhinestone suits, turned excess into art. His concerts were part performance, part fashion show, a kaleidoscope of feathers, sequins, and neon lights that made fans want to sparkle too. And then there were bands like Fleetwood Mac, effortlessly stylish in a softer way. Stevie Nicks floated across stages in shawls and velvet, layers of lace trailing behind her like smoke. Her look was witchy and romantic, timeless and otherworldly. She made mystery fashionable. Young women saw her and understood that elegance didn't need to be polished. It could be wild, natural, and deeply personal. Record covers became style Bibles. You didn't just buy music, you bought an image. The Rolling Stones' Lips and Tongue logo, Led Zeppelin's symbols, the Eagles' Desert Cool. Every sleeve told you what kind of world the music came from, and what kind of person you might be if you listened. You could walk into a record store and feel like you were walking through a fashion show of sound. The influence bled back onto television. Late-night talk shows and variety specials brought rock stars into living rooms across America. Audiences saw them not as distant gods, but as living, breathing people wearing things no one else dared to wear. It gave courage to experiment, to layer, to glam up, to add that one piece that made you feel a little more you. By the end of the decade, television and rock music had merged into a single cultural mirror. Every outfit on TV, every jacket on a guitarist, every hairstyle on a pop idol rippled outward through high schools, office buildings, and suburban malls. For the first time, fashion moved at the speed of signal and song. Looking back now, the photos almost hum with energy, the bright stage lights, the confident smiles, the sense that no one was afraid to shine. The icons of the 70s didn't follow trends. They were the trends, and they taught everyone watching that fashion wasn't about money or fame. It was about courage. The courage to be seen, to stand out, to turn your life, for even a moment, into a show worth watching. Evenings in the 1970s belonged to the television, and no genre captured the heart of that era quite like the sitcom. Before streaming, before cable, before you could choose what to watch at any moment of the day, everyone gathered around the same shows. It was communal, almost sacred. The living room glowed with soft light from that boxy screen, and the laughter that drifted through American neighborhoods each night was shared, synchronized, and real. Sitcoms weren't just entertainment. They were windows into the world we wanted to believe in. They gave families something to talk about at breakfast, phrases to repeat at school, and characters who felt like distant cousins. Each show had its own rhythm, its own heartbeat, and somehow they all reflected who we were becoming as a nation. The Mary Tyler Moore Show led the way. Mary Richards, single, independent, and endlessly optimistic, was unlike anyone television had shown before. She worked at a newsroom, lived in her own apartment, and smiled her way through challenges with grace and humor. Her iconic toss of that beret in the opening credits became a symbol of liberation, not just for women, but for anyone trying to find their place in a changing world. You could feel her warmth through the screen, her confidence understated but magnetic. Viewers didn't just laugh with her, they rooted for her. Then there was All in the Family, which didn't just make people laugh, it made them think. Archie Bunker's armchair became a cultural battleground, a place where America's contradictions sat side by side. The show wasn't afraid to touch raw nerves, politics, race, gender, generation gaps, but it did it with humor that disarmed and dialogue that lingered. Every episode ended with laughter, yes, but also with reflection. For a half hour, viewers confronted themselves, and somehow, they kept coming back for more. The Brady Bunch gave the opposite feeling, a pastel dream of blended family perfection. 6 kids, 2 parents, 1 perfectly groomed house, and not a hair out of place. It was the world as we wished it could be. Problems always had neat resolutions. Conflicts ended in hugs. The laughter track felt like applause for optimism itself. And those outfits, the matching polyester suits, the colorful dresses, the impossibly coordinated family photos, became part of pop culture forever. There was Happy Days, too, dripping with nostalgia even back then. It made the 50s look golden, the jukebox glow a little warmer, the friendships a little tighter. The Fonz, with his leather jacket and thumbs-up charm, became a national hero of cool. People tuned in just to see him walk into Arnold's diner, snap his fingers, and make the jukebox come to life. It was simple, harmless, comforting, a televised time capsule of innocence that made the chaotic 70s feel a little steadier. And while sitcoms like MASH Asterisk began as comedy, they grew into something deeper, a mix of humor and heartbreak that reflected the complexity of real life. Set during the Korean War, but written for a world still healing from Vietnam, it spoke to the confusion of a generation caught between duty and doubt. The laughter in MASH Asterisk was different, softer, layered with irony, often followed by silence that said more than any joke could. What tied all these shows together was their honesty. Even at their most exaggerated, they felt grounded in something true. You could see your father in Archie Bunker, your sister in Marcia Brady, your best friend in Richie Cunningham. They captured the way families teased, argued, and loved each other. The furniture looked familiar, the kitchens were messy, and the jokes landed because they came from places we all recognized. The sitcoms of the 70s also changed how the world looked. They brought more faces, more voices, more diversity into living rooms. Shows like Good Times and The Jeffersons gave black families center stage, with humor rooted in strength and truth. They weren't background characters anymore. They were leading stories, living complex lives, and making people laugh while opening doors that had long been shut. Looking back now, those half-hour bursts of laughter feel like something more than nostalgia. They were bridges between generations, between beliefs, between people who might never have agreed on anything else. For 30 minutes a night, America sat down together, no matter how divided it was outside those walls. The laughter was shared, the themes were real, and even though the sets were made of plywood and the jokes rehearsed, the feeling was authentic. The sitcoms of the 70s didn't just entertain, they defined an era. They gave us heroes in heels and heartthrobs in leather jackets, wisdom hidden inside punchlines, and hope disguised as laughter. The sound of that studio audience still echoes like a memory, a wave of laughter, applause, and comfort rolling through time. A reminder that sometimes the simplest stories are the ones that stay with us the longest. Before multiplexes and digital tickets, before recliner seats and surround sound, there was the Great American Drive-In, a field under a wide open sky, a massive screen standing against the sunset, and the hum of hundreds of engines idling like an orchestra tuning up before the show. The drive-in theater wasn't just a way to watch movies. It was a ritual, a gathering place, and for many people, the setting of their fondest memories. You could feel it in the air as evening fell. The sun slipped behind the tree line, the crickets started their chorus, and the lot began to fill with the glow of headlights. Cars lined up in neat rows, families unloading lawn chairs, kids in pajamas carrying blankets, and teenagers pretending to help but mostly waiting for the dark. The smell of popcorn and gasoline mixed into something strangely comforting, the scent of summer freedom. The big metal speaker boxes hung from posts between cars, each with a scratchy, tin-can sound that somehow made the movie feel more personal. Later, they'd switch to FM radio, but in the 70s, those speakers were part of the experience. You'd roll down your window, hang the box on the sill, and adjust the volume until it stopped hissing. The sound wasn't perfect. Sometimes it crackled, sometimes it faded, but it didn't matter. The magic was bigger than the movie itself. Families packed coolers with sodas and sandwiches, but most couldn't resist a trip to the concession stand. The neon lights buzzed. Teenagers in paper hats served popcorn in cardboard buckets, and the air smelled of butter, candy, and fried everything. 10 minutes until showtime, the loudspeaker would say, and you'd hear the clatter of doors as everyone hurried back to their cars. The screen flickered to life with those animated intermission ads, dancing hot dogs, talking soda cups, smiling boxes of popcorn, cheerful and slightly surreal in the twilight. Then came that moment. The projector beam cutting through the darkness, a pale cone of light filled with drifting dust and bugs, stretching all the way to the screen. The movie began, and for a few hours, that patch of asphalt became another world. Kids sat on car hoods with blankets around their shoulders, couples shared milkshakes through straws, and little brothers inevitably fell asleep before the second feature. The films themselves were a mix of everything: blockbusters, B-movies, westerns, horror flicks, and teenage comedies that played to both the kids in the back seat and the adults in the front. You could watch Jaws under the stars and feel the goosebumps spread just a little quicker, or catch Star Wars for the first time and see lightsabers reflected in car windows all around you. Sometimes the reels would break or burn out, and you'd hear the whole crowd groan together. The projectionist would fix it, the film would flicker back to life, and everyone would cheer as if the hero himself had returned. For teenagers, though, the drive-in meant something else entirely. It was freedom. It was privacy. The car became your own little universe, your own movie inside the movie. The music from the radio mixed with the soundtrack. Headlights flashed in rhythm, and hearts raced in ways that had nothing to do with the plot. Whole relationships began and ended under those giant glowing screens. There was laughter, sometimes tears, but always a sense that life was happening right there, in the flicker between frames. When the credits rolled, no one rushed to leave. Engines started one by one, the rumble blending into the night like soft thunder. The projector light dimmed, the screen went white, and people lingered, finishing their popcorn, stretching their legs, waving goodbye through open windows. The exit road glowed with taillights moving slowly through the dark, a quiet caravan heading back to reality. There was something communal about it, even when you didn't speak to anyone else. You sat in your car surrounded by strangers, but for a few hours, you were all watching the same dream. The laughter, the gasps, the cheers, they rippled across the lot like waves. It was shared emotion in its purest form, long before social media could measure it. Looking back now, the drive-in feels almost mythical, too simple, too sincere to have ever really existed. But it did. The screens are rusting now, the speaker poles standing like silent ghosts in empty fields. Yet if you close your eyes, you can still hear it. The crunch of gravel under tires, the hum of the projector, and the faint echo of dialogue carried by the wind. The drive-in wasn't just about movies. It was about togetherness. It was about pausing the world long enough to sit under the stars with people you loved, or people you were just beginning to love, and letting light tell stories across the night sky. For a generation growing up in the glow of that big white screen, it wasn't just cinema. It was life itself, projected 50 feet tall. By the middle of the 1970s, something was shifting in Hollywood. The quiet dramas and counterculture experiments of the late 60s were giving way to something louder, faster, and bigger, stories that filled theaters and lived in the public imagination long after the lights came up. The blockbuster was being born, though no one quite knew it yet. It began almost by accident, with a mechanical shark that barely worked. When Jaws hit theaters in the summer of 1975, it didn't just scare audiences, it changed cinema forever. People lined up around city blocks, clutching popcorn and nervously laughing as the posters promised, "You'll never go in the water again." The shark itself, famously unreliable, barely appeared on screen, but that only made it more terrifying. The suspense, the swelling score by John Williams, the slow zoom of fear, it all came together in a way no one had seen before. Suddenly, summer became movie season. Theaters became packed, drive-ins overflowed, and Hollywood realized that spectacle could bring people together in a way nothing else could. 2 years later, another phenomenon arrived, a film that transported audiences far, far away. Star Wars was more than science fiction. It was a myth reborn in laser light. The moment that opening crawl appeared on screen and John Williams' orchestra thundered through the speakers, something in pop culture shifted. Kids gripped the arms of their seats. Adults forgot about the real world for 2 hours. For the first time, imagination itself had a budget big enough to make dreams feel real. People didn't just watch Star Wars, they lived it. They quoted it, reenacted it, collected it. Toy stores sold out of action figures before Christmas, and suddenly film wasn't just film. It was a universe that extended into bedrooms, playgrounds, and daydreams. George Lucas had unknowingly invented the modern movie franchise, where stories continued long after the credits rolled. Theaters had never seen anything like it. Audiences came back again and again, dragging friends, family, and anyone who hadn't yet seen The Force. But the blockbuster wasn't only about space battles or monsters. It was about feeling something larger than life, something that hit you in the chest. Rocky did that in 1976. A small movie made with big heart. It told a story everyone understood, a regular guy getting one shot to prove himself. The image of Sylvester Stallone running up those Philadelphia steps became as iconic as any special effect. The music swelled, the camera shook, and when Rocky raised his arms, audiences everywhere did too. Then came Saturday Night Fever, another kind of phenomenon. It wasn't about aliens or heroes. It was about a working-class kid with rhythm and a white suit. The film captured the pulse of disco culture in a way that felt both authentic and mythic. John Travolta's strut down that Brooklyn sidewalk, staying alive, pounding through the speakers, was pure electricity. The dance floor became a symbol of escape from jobs, from expectations, from the ordinary grind of life. Suddenly, the cinema wasn't just a window to other worlds. It was a mirror reflecting our own. By the end of the decade, the formula was clear: make audiences feel something grand. Adventure, fear, triumph, heartbreak. It didn't matter which emotion, as long as it filled the screen. Directors like Steven Spielberg, George Lucas, and Francis Ford Coppola turned film into an experience. You didn't just go to the movies, you participated in an event. The posters became artwork, the soundtracks became radio hits, and box office numbers became part of everyday conversation. Blockbusters also changed how we gathered. Seeing a movie became a social ritual: dates, family nights, friend outings. People didn't just talk about films afterward. They quoted them, hummed their themes, and debated which moment made them cry or cheer. For a generation caught between the idealism of the 60s and the uncertainty of the 80s, these stories offered something rare: unity. For 2 hours in the dark, everyone felt the same heartbeat. And perhaps that's what made the 70s such a turning point. Movies became more than stories. They became shared emotions, shared language, shared memory. Whether it was a shark fin slicing through the surf, a spaceship jumping to hyperspace, or a boxer running toward his destiny, The images stayed burned into the collective mind. Even now, when you hear the first few notes of the Jaws theme, or see a lightsaber ignite, or watch Rocky throw a punch in slow motion, something inside still stirs. The magic of the blockbuster wasn't just the spectacle, it was the sincerity. Those films believed in the power of awe, in the idea that if you gave people something to believe in, they'd follow you anywhere, even into the water, even into space, even into the ring. The 70s taught Hollywood how to dream big, and it taught audiences that the world could be larger, brighter, and louder than they'd ever imagined. The projector light flickered, the crowd held its breath, and from that moment on, movies were never small again. For kids growing up in the 1970s, Saturday morning wasn't just another day. It was the day. The one morning of the week where you didn't need an alarm clock, because excitement woke you before the sun did. You'd stumble into the living room still in pajamas, bowl of cereal in hand, the smell of milk and sugar mixing with the faint electric warmth of the television warming up. The screen flickered to life, and just like that, the world outside disappeared. The rest of the week belonged to adults. News, sitcoms, talk shows, responsibility. But Saturday mornings? Those were sacred hours reserved entirely for children. Every channel had its lineup, each one carefully programmed to keep young eyes glued to the screen. ABC, CBS, NBC, they all competed to win the attention of millions of kids armed with cereal boxes and imaginations too big for real life. The air was filled with a kind of magic that only exists in memory. Bright colors, bouncing music, and voices that sounded larger than life. Scooby-Doo, Where Are You? Was a staple. The familiar formula never got old. Every episode had the same comfort. A spooky setting, a masked villain, and that gang of friends in their psychedelic van, solving mysteries with nothing but curiosity and courage. You could almost smell the musty halls of every haunted house, feel the thrill as the trap was set, and grin when the villain said, "And I would have gotten away with it too, if it weren't for you meddling kids." Then there was the Flintstones, still holding strong from the previous decade, teaching a new generation that even cavemen had family drama. Or the Jetsons, where flying cars and robot maids gave a peek into the future everyone secretly hoped would come true. The two shows, one set in the Stone Age, one in space, became a perfect loop of imagination, showing how the past and future could coexist in laughter. And Looney Tunes, the crown jewel, Bugs Bunny, Daffy Duck, Porky Pig, while Coyote, those weren't just cartoons, they were comedic institutions. They taught timing, wit, and mischief better than any classroom ever could. The slapstick violence, the clever wordplay, the orchestral soundtracks, they were works of art disguised as chaos. Kids laughed without realizing they were absorbing lessons in humor, rhythm, and storytelling that would stay with them for life. Each show had its own universe. Josie and the Pussycats, the Super Friends, Fat Albert and the Cosby Kids, Hong Kong Phooey, the Pink Panther, Speed Buggy. They came one after another in a colorful parade. The stories weren't complicated. They didn't need to be. They were about friendship, teamwork, courage, and the simple idea that doing the right thing always mattered. And the commercials, they were almost part of the show. Toys, cereals, action figures, board games. Every break was an explosion of jingles and color. They're magically delicious. Snap, crackle, pop. You can't eat just one. Those slogans stuck in kids' heads as firmly as the theme songs did. Sometimes, The line between the show and the ad blurred completely. He-Man, G.I. Joe, and Transformers were still years away, but their seeds were planted here. Saturday mornings were where imagination met marketing, and somehow, nobody minded. Parents didn't complain either. For those few hours, the house was quiet. No fighting, no whining, just the soft hum of the TV and the occasional giggle from the couch. Moms made breakfast in peace, dads read the paper, and kids sat mesmerized, eyes wide and hearts full. It was a family truce built on cartoons. By noon, the spell started to fade. The shows ended, the screen filled with sports or news, and reality crept back in. But for those few hours, the living room was a portal. Kids believed animals could talk, ghosts could be unmasked, and rockets could take you anywhere you wanted to go. Saturday mornings made the world feel endless, a universe that reset every week, ready to begin again with a new adventure. Decades later, people still talk about those mornings with a kind of reverence. Maybe it's because the cartoons themselves were simpler, or maybe it's because the world was. There was no streaming, no on-demand, no rewinding. You either woke up in time, or you missed it, and that made it special. Those hours belonged entirely to childhood, fleeting and bright. If you close your eyes now, you can still hear it. The sound of a spoon clinking in a cereal bowl, the echo of a theme song bouncing through the house, the distant laugh track from a cartoon where nobody ever truly got hurt. It wasn't just entertainment. It was a weekly ritual of joy, innocence, and imagination, one that made every Saturday feel like the best day of the week. If there was one device that truly defined the rhythm of the 1970s home, it wasn't the radio anymore. It was the television. The TV wasn't just an appliance. It was a piece of furniture, a glowing centerpiece that anchored the family room. Heavy, boxy, framed in dark wood with dials that clicked when you turned them. The television was both object and altar. People arranged couches around it like pews, coffee tables pointed directly toward it, and most homes had one sacred rule. When the TV was on, you didn't talk over it. For earlier generations, television had been a novelty, but in the 70s, it became a lifestyle. The living room wasn't just where families gathered, it was where they lived. Every household had its own rituals. Who got to hold the remote, if you had one? Who was in charge of adjusting the antenna? Who got to choose the channel? Back then, choosing a show wasn't about scrolling through hundreds of options. It was about catching the right one at the right time. You missed it, and that was it. No replays, no recordings, no second chances. The average set had two big silver knobs, one for power and volume, and another that clicked through the limited number of channels with a sound you could feel in your fingertips. Thunk, thunk, thunk. Kids took turns twisting it, always overshooting the right channel by one, while parents shouted, "You're wearing out the dial." The antenna on top, rabbit ears, was an eternal source of frustration. A small movement to the left could mean perfect picture or total static. Sometimes, someone had to stand and hold it in place, balancing like a human lightning rod just to keep the Muppet Show clear. Color television was spreading fast by the 70s, and it felt like the future unfolding in your living room. Even if your family had a black and white set, you'd visit a neighbor with a color one just to marvel at how vivid it was. Seeing a red car or blue dress on screen for the first time didn't just look impressive, it felt miraculous. The technology didn't just add color, it added wonder. The networks ruled everything. ABC, NBC, CBS, they were the trinity of entertainment. They dictated what families talked about, what trends spread, what everyone knew by heart. If you didn't watch a show, you were left out of Monday morning conversations at school or work. The schedule itself shaped time. Evening news at 6, prime time hits at 8, and by 11, the national anthem would play before the screen faded to static. Television also brought the world closer. News anchors weren't just voices, they were trusted friends. Walter Cronkite telling you how the war was ending, or that a new president had taken office. It felt personal. You saw it, you felt it, you believed it. For the first time, world events didn't live only in newspapers. They lived in your home, flickering in the same light that illuminated your dinner table. But the real revolution wasn't just in what TV showed. It was in what it represented. It became a common language. Families gathered every night to watch the same stories unfold, to laugh, cry, or gasp together. Parents and kids shared favorite shows, even if they didn't always share favorite values. When the opening credits rolled, life slowed down. Dinner dishes waited. Homework paused. The house grew still. And then, cable began to whisper its way into the culture. In the late 70s, it was still a novelty, a promise of endless choice, more channels than you could count. HBO was in its infancy, quietly setting the stage for a future where television wouldn't be bound by antennas or schedules. It felt almost unreal, like science fiction. For now, though, there was comfort in the simplicity. A single screen, one room, one family. The TV wasn't just a source of entertainment. It was a mirror reflecting the era itself. Curious, communal, hopeful, and flawed. It united people in ways that are hard to imagine today. Whether you were watching The Tonight Show with Johnny Carson or catching the reruns of Gilligan's Island on a lazy afternoon, that glowing box was always there, steady, familiar, quietly humming in the background of your life. Even the static had a strange kind of poetry. When the night ended and the signal faded, that white noise filled the room like a lullaby. It was a reminder that somewhere out there, the world was still awake, that life beyond your walls kept moving. Looking back, those living rooms feel like small theaters of humanity. The soft hum of electricity, the smell of warm circuits, the laughter of families huddled together on shag carpet. Before screens became personal, they were shared. The TV didn't separate us, it brought us closer. And for one golden decade, the light that flickered from that heavy wooden box made every home feel like the center of the world. Before screens glowed in every pocket and controllers blinked with LED lights, playtime happened on the living room floor. Carpets became battlefields, kingdoms, racetracks, and empires, all ruled by dice, tokens, and imagination. In the 1970s, board games weren't just toys, they were experiences. They brought families together, tested friendships, and turned rainy afternoons into memories that still echo with laughter. The setup was a ritual. Someone would pull the cardboard box from the closet, slightly frayed at the corners, lid taped once or twice, dice rattling softly inside. You'd unfold the board with that satisfying creak, revealing a world made of color and promise. Whether it was the bright, sugary tracks of Candyland or the money-scented streets of Monopoly, the game began long before the first roll of the dice. Every household had its favorites. Monopoly was the king, of course. The rustle of paper money, the clatter of metal tokens, the little dog, the thimble, the top hat. The air filled with negotiation, alliances, and eventual betrayal. Everyone swore they'd play fair this time, but by the end, someone was always furious, someone was always gloating, and someone was always the quiet banker who slowly bought up every property on the board. You learned about business before you ever understood interest rates. You learned about patience too, because Monopoly never truly ended. It just faded when someone flipped the board or dinner was ready. Then there was the game of life, with its pastel cars and little peg people representing the family you'd someday have. The spinner clicked as it turned, and everyone leaned in, waiting to see if you'd land on payday or taxes. You could feel the thrill of becoming a doctor, a rock star, or a teacher. The entire arc of adulthood condensed into an hour of laughter and friendly rivalry. Somehow, no matter how much fake money you made, you always ended up envious of whoever drew the mansion tile. Clue brought out the detectives in everyone. The living room turned into a crime scene. You'd whisper theories, bluff your way through interrogations, and triumphantly slam your notebook shut when you thought you'd solved it. It was Colonel Mustard in the study with the candlestick. The suspense was real. The victory, even sweeter. Sorry, Trouble, Chutes and Ladders, Connect 4, Battleship, the list went on. Each game had its own universe, its own soundtrack of dice rolls, clicks, and shouts of triumph. Trouble had that unforgettable pop-o-matic bubble in the center, snapping like thunder with every press. The simple joy of hearing that plastic dome pop and seeing the die bounce inside could carry you through a whole afternoon. But it wasn't just about the games. It was about the people around them. Parents crouched beside their kids, laughing harder than they had all week. Siblings competed fiercely but always circled back to rematches. Friends stayed longer than planned, chasing one last victory before bedtime. The living room became a gathering place, a patch of carpet where time seemed to slow down. Snacks were part of the ritual too. Bowls of pretzels, cups of soda, maybe a plate of homemade cookies. Someone always spilled something on the board, and someone always shouted, "Don't move the pieces." You didn't need high-definition graphics to feel the excitement. You needed eye contact, banter, and that sense that what happened on the board somehow mattered in real life. Even the boxes themselves held a kind of charm. The artwork, the typography, the smiling faces of perfect families frozen in mid-laughter. Those covers promised fun, connection, and a little bit of friendly chaos. Opening one felt like stepping into a story, and when the game was over, the cleanup had its own quiet satisfaction. Folding the board, counting the cards, making sure no pieces went missing. The last sound before the night ended was often the gentle slide of the lid back onto the box, a small, final click that signaled the fun was safely stored until next time. Board games taught more than strategy. They taught patience, negotiation, and sportsmanship, or at least how to fake it. They taught you that sometimes life gives you bad rolls, and all you can do is laugh, move your piece, and keep playing. When people talk about the 70s, they often mention the music, the fashion, the cars. But for anyone who lived it, those moments on the floor, surrounded by friends and family, elbows deep in dice and dreams, were just as much a part of what made that decade special. There was no leaderboard, no internet, no next level. There was just the laughter echoing off the walls and the knowledge that for those few hours, nothing else mattered but the game in front of you and the people playing it beside you. Some toys from the 70s weren't about competition. They were about creation. They invited kids to imagine, to build, to make something from nothing using their hands and a little bit of wonder. There was no battery to charge, no screen to stare into, just quiet magic that lived inside plastic shells and simple mechanics. Among the most beloved were three that turned ordinary afternoons into something extraordinary: the Etch-a-Sketch, the Light Bright, and the Easy Bake Oven. The Etch-a-Sketch was pure genius, part toy, part art tool, part lesson in patience. A red frame, a gray screen, and two little white knobs at the bottom that controlled an invisible stylus inside. Turn one knob, and the line went up or down. Turn the other, and it went side to side. The challenge was coordination. Drawing a perfect curve was nearly impossible, but that was the fun of it. Every kid tried to master it, twisting both knobs carefully, their tongues sticking out in concentration. What you created lived only until the next shake. With a quick flip and a few raps against your palm, the image disappeared into a cloud of aluminum dust, the screen blank again, ready for another attempt. You learned something from that, about impermanence, about starting over, about how beauty didn't have to last to matter. Some kids drew houses or cars. Others managed portraits, names, even mazes. And though the results were often crooked or wobbly, it didn't matter. The Etch-a-Sketch wasn't about perfection. It was about persistence. Then there was the Light Bright, a toy that turned darkness into color. The black paper template slid behind a grid of tiny holes, and kids pressed in small translucent pegs that glowed when the light inside turned on. Red, blue, green, yellow, white. 100 little points of color shining together to form butterflies, rockets, hearts, or whatever your imagination demanded. When the room lights dimmed and the Light Bright glowed, it felt like holding your own galaxy. Every household had that faint smell, a mix of warm plastic and electricity. That meant the Light Bright was alive. Kids would sit cross-legged on the floor, sorting pegs by color, squinting in concentration as the picture came to life dot by dot. It was delicate work, slow and quiet, but endlessly satisfying. And when you were done, you'd sit back and just look at it, the soft hum of the bulb filling the silence. It wasn't flashy, but it felt magical, a moment of light made entirely by your own hands. And then, of course, came the Easy Bake Oven, the toy that made kids feel like culinary geniuses. A small plastic box powered by a single light bulb that could actually bake a cake. It sounds unbelievable now, but to a child in the 70s, it was the height of innovation. The tiny metal pans slid into the side like something from a diner, and a few minutes later, you had a real, warm dessert, small, uneven, but made by you. The smell of those miniature cakes filled the whole room, sugary, artificial, perfect. The frosting never spread quite right, and the texture was always a little strange, but nobody cared. It wasn't about taste, it was about pride. Kids would emerge from the kitchen holding their creation like a trophy, eyes wide with satisfaction. Some even set up bakeries for their parents or siblings, charging a few pennies per treat. The Easy Bake wasn't just a toy. It was a first taste of independence. These toys had something in common. They all gave you control. They didn't tell stories for you. They let you create them. There was no right way to play. You didn't win or lose. You made something that existed only because you imagined it. And when it was gone, erased, dismantled, eaten, the joy lingered anyway. They also taught patience in a world that was starting to speed up. Each one required time, focus, and care. There was no instant gratification, no shortcuts. The process was the reward. The shaking, the plugging, the baking, they were quiet meditations disguised as play. Looking back, it's easy to see why those toys endure in memory. They were simple, yes, but they spoke to something timeless. that deep human need to create, to leave a mark, to build light out of darkness. Kids who grew up with them didn't just make pictures or cakes. They made confidence, imagination, and patience. Even today, an old Etch-a-Sketch or light bright pulled from a dusty attic still feels alive. The knobs still turn. The bulbs still hum. And for a moment, if you listen closely, you can almost hear the laughter of a child in the next room. Twisting, pressing, waiting, creating their own small masterpiece in the golden glow of the 70s. The 1970s were the dawn of a revolution no one quite understood at the time. The moment play leaped off the table and onto a glowing screen. It began quietly, humbly, in bars, bowling alleys, and family rooms, a strange new kind of entertainment that didn't use dice or cards or miniature pieces, but pixels, paddles, and light. The video game was born, and the world was about to change. At first, it didn't even look like a game. In 1972, a simple black and white screen flickered to life with a glowing square bouncing between two lines. Pong, the name was as minimal as the game itself, became a sensation. 2 players, 2 paddles, 1 ball. No instructions needed. You just played. The controls were as simple as turning a dial, but the feeling was electric. Every hit of that digital ball came with a tiny pulse of competition. Crowds gathered around the machines in arcades and bars, cheering, groaning, laughing. For the first time, a screen was interactive. It responded to you. Home versions soon followed. Families huddled around televisions as fathers, mothers, and kids took turns twisting knobs on bulky consoles that plugged directly into the set. The graphics were primitive, but no one cared. The glow of that pixelated ball felt futuristic. Parents who'd grown up with marbles and jacks found themselves grinning as they served digital volleys across the screen. The living room, once the territory of board games and card tables, was now the first arena of home entertainment. The Atari 2600 would arrive a few years later, and suddenly, games weren't just single experiences, they were worlds. Plastic cartridges slid into the console with a satisfying click, each one carrying a different kind of adventure. Space battles, car races, mazes, and haunted mansions. The possibilities felt endless. The graphics were blocky, yes, but the imagination filled in the gaps. Kids stared into the glowing screen and saw galaxies, forests, and treasure maps. The sound effects were simple but unforgettable: bleeps, bloops, digital chimes that echoed through the house. Each one had its own charm, its own rhythm. The electronic pulse of Space Invaders was hypnotic. The little footsteps in adventure were almost comical, and that rising heartbeat of tension as enemies closed in felt more real than it had any right to be. For a generation raised on radio dramas and black and white reruns, the idea that a TV could respond to you felt like science fiction. Arcades began to pop up everywhere. Dimly lit, noisy, full of flashing lights and the smell of popcorn and coins. You'd hear the clink of quarters being fed into machines, the steady pulse of electronic music, and the low murmur of competition. Each cabinet stood like a monument: Asteroids, Space Invaders, Breakout, Tank, Computer Space. The artwork on their sides was bright and wild, promising experiences that stretched far beyond what their screens could show. Kids saved their allowances just for a few plays, and every quarter felt like a ticket to another world. But what made those early games special wasn't the technology, it was the togetherness. Whether it was a living room full of laughter or a smoky arcade filled with strangers, games brought people face to face. You played next to someone, not across the internet. You saw their reaction, felt their energy, heard their laughter echoing beside yours. There were no high-definition graphics, no cinematic storylines, just pure, simple fun, glowing in a dark room. Parents didn't quite know what to make of it. Some thought it was a passing fad, others worried it would rot kids' brains. But most couldn't deny the joy on their children's faces, the wide-eyed excitement, the focus, the cheers when someone finally broke a high score. For many, it was the first time technology felt personal, not a tool, but a toy. By the end of the decade, video games had moved from novelty to necessity. The Atari logo was as recognizable as Coca-Cola. Game cartridges sat next to stacks of vinyl records and VHS tapes, and every kid had a favorite title. The seeds of a multi-billion-dollar industry had been planted, but in the 70s, it still felt small, innocent, full of promise. If you close your eyes and think back to that time, you can almost see it, a dark living room, a glowing screen, the sound of laughter mixed with digital tones. The air thick with popcorn, the carpet warm beneath you as you sat too close to the TV. It wasn't about winning. It wasn't about scores. It was about discovery, the thrill of realizing that the future had arrived, and it came with a joystick. The video game wasn't just another toy. It was a portal, the moment imagination fused with electricity and became something you could hold in your hands. And though nobody knew it then, that soft glow on the screen would never fade. It was the beginning of a new kind of play, one that would follow us forever. Before smartphones, before group chats, before you could text a friend to ask where they were, the world outside was the playground, and the bicycle was the key that unlocked it. Every kid in the 1970s knew that freedom came with two wheels and a little bit of scraped-up skin. The bike wasn't just transportation, it was independence. It was the first taste of going somewhere without asking permission. The moment you learned to ride was a rite of passage. A parent jogging behind you, one hand gripping the seat, the other waving in midair, shouting, "You've got it! You've got it!" The wobbles, the panic, the sudden miracle of balance. And then, that electric rush of realizing you were flying. Training wheels rattling across driveways, the wind in your hair, the world opening wider with every push of the pedal. Every neighborhood had its bike gang, a ragtag collection of kids on banana seats, dirt bikes, and hand-me-down Schwinn's. You'd meet after school, line up at the end of the street, and race toward nowhere in particular. The air smelled like summer, cut grass, gasoline, and distant barbecue smoke. Someone would pop a wheelie, someone else would skid out, and someone would inevitably crash, tearing a hole in their jeans and their knee. But nobody cried for long. You just wiped it off, showed the scab like a badge of honor, and kept riding. The bikes themselves were personal. Some had streamers flowing from the handlebars. Some had baskets with playing cards clipped to the spokes so they clicked like engines. The more creative kids decorated theirs with stickers, reflectors, or baseball cards that rattled like motorcycles when you rode fast enough. Every scratch, every dent, told a story. That turn you took too fast, that hill you finally conquered. You knew the limits of your world by the distance you could ride. The block was your territory, the next street over was adventure, and the corner store, that was practically another country. You'd pedal there with a pocket full of change, lean your bike against the wall, and walk in sweaty, sunburned, and proud. Inside, the air was cool, the shelves lined with treasures, candy bars, soda bottles, comic books. You'd pick your prize, a grape soda or maybe a pack of baseball cards. and sit outside in the shade, trading stories and sweets before heading home again. Sometimes the bikes became spaceships, sometimes horses, sometimes escape pods from imaginary danger. You'd build ramps out of plywood and bricks, daring each other to jump higher, faster, longer. The crashes were spectacular. Someone's handlebar would bend, someone's chain would snap, but nobody cared. The bikes were patched up with duct tape and hope. You learned to fix a flat tire before you learned to drive. In the evenings, when the light turned gold and the air cooled, the world seemed endless. You'd ride in circles until the street lights flickered on, the universal signal that it was time to go home. Parents didn't track you, they trusted you. There were no GPS devices, no check-ins. The rule was simple: be home by dark. And somehow, you always were. Those twilight rides had a feeling you can still remember. That mix of exhaustion and freedom, the hum of the tires against the pavement, the crickets singing from the fields nearby. The sky would turn pink, the first stars would appear, and you'd feel like you owned the world. In winter, when the bikes were put away, you'd miss them like friends. You'd wipe off the dust in spring, pump the tires full of air, and take that first triumphant ride again, feeling the same thrill you felt the day you learned. The bicycle was more than metal and rubber. It was a symbol of growth, of courage, of independence. It taught you balance in more ways than one. It taught you how to fall and how to get back up. It showed you that the best adventures didn't need a plan, just a little time and an open road. Looking back now, it's hard not to smile at how simple it was. A bike, a summer day, and nowhere in particular to go. Yet somehow, that was everything. Those rides were freedom distilled into motion, childhood stretched across miles of pavement and sky. You didn't need a destination. You just needed to keep pedaling, chasing the sun until it dipped below the trees. And the world, for that brief golden moment, felt infinite. Long before screens could pull you inside, the outdoors was the default setting of childhood. The neighborhood itself was the playground, an endless, open-ended world that belonged entirely to the imagination of whoever stepped outside first. In the 1970s, kids didn't need plans, schedules, or supervision. All it took was the sound of a screen door slamming, the echo of sneakers on the driveway, and someone shouting, "Let's play." Games didn't come from stores. They came from invention. There were the classics, of course: tag, hide and seek, kick the can, but every street had its own variations, its own rules passed down by older kids like folklore. The boundaries were flexible. You're out if you cross the driveway. No, that tree's safe. The arguments were constant but good-natured, always resolved by laughter or a rematch. The sound of summer evenings carried a rhythm. The thud of a ball against pavement, the creak of a swing, the hum of cicadas blending with the shouts of kids negotiating the next round. The air smelled of cut grass and dirt, of chalk and popsicles. You didn't need equipment. A stick could be a sword, a bucket could be a helmet, a patch of mud could be a universe. Every backyard felt enormous back then. Fences were suggestions, not barriers. Kids drifted from one yard to the next, scaling low wooden gates or squeezing through gaps in hedges. Someone's dad would be mowing the lawn, someone's mom would be hanging laundry, and in between those worlds, you built kingdoms. Forts made of cardboard boxes, tree houses nailed together from scrap wood, secret bases marked by nothing more than imagination. Baseball games unfolded in cul-de-sacs and empty lots. The crack of a bat made from an old broom handle echoed down the street. A car coming through the intersection meant an immediate timeout, everyone scattering to the curb until the driver waved and the game resumed. Sometimes the ball went too far, into a neighbor's yard, into the thorns, over a fence. Retrieving it was an adventure of its own. And then there were the nights when lightning bugs lit up the darkness, tiny stars caught in mason jars. Kids would chase them barefoot, grass cool under their feet, laughter trailing behind them like music. The sky overhead seemed impossibly high, the stars endless, the air alive with the hum of summer. Those nights felt eternal. Winter had its own games. Snowball fights that started as friendly and always ended as battles of pride. Sledding down icy hills until your fingers went numb, then rushing inside to thaw them on a heater or a mug of hot chocolate. Every season brought its own rituals, its own form of play. There was something sacred about the unstructured nature of it all. Nobody told you when to start or stop. There were no playdates, no adult referees. The world belonged to kids from the moment they stepped outside until the streetlights came on. That orange glow was the universal signal. One by one, bikes rolled back into garages, chalk drawings faded in the dusk, and screen doors slammed again as kids returned home, sweaty, dirty, happy. Sometimes, play turned into storytelling. You'd gather under a tree or sit on the curb, inventing tales about monsters, aliens, or secret treasure buried under the old oak. Someone would swear they saw something strange in the woods, and everyone would promise to investigate the next day. You didn't need special effects. You had imagination, and that was enough. There were scraped knees, bee stings, grass stains that never quite came out of your jeans. But those little scars were souvenirs. They marked the places where you'd fallen and gotten up, where you'd learned your limits and then ignored them anyway. Looking back now, it's hard to describe that kind of freedom to anyone who didn't live it. The world felt safe enough to explore and big enough to never get boring. Parents didn't worry because they didn't have to. Everyone watched out for everyone else's kids. The neighborhood was one giant family, connected by yards, laughter, and the occasional shared popsicle when the ice cream truck came by. And when the day finally ended, when the last friend waved goodnight and the porch lights clicked off, you'd lie in bed with grass still on your legs and the faint hum of crickets outside the window. You'd replay the day in your head, already planning what tomorrow's adventure would be. It wasn't organized, expensive, or documented. It was just life unfolding under the open sky, one scraped knee, one inside joke, one sunset at a time. Childhood in the 70s didn't need screens or gadgets to feel full. It just needed a patch of grass, a few good friends, and the promise of another endless day waiting outside the door. The heart of the 1970s beat loudest in the kitchen. Every home had one that felt like its own universe, a mix of warmth, clatter, and aroma that wrapped around you the moment you stepped inside. The wallpaper was bright, often patterned with flowers or fruits that looked far happier than real ones ever did. The counters gleamed with formica. The floor tiles shone in avocado green or burnt orange, and somewhere, always, there was the steady hum of a refrigerator working through the night. That sound, that low mechanical murmur, was as familiar as a lullaby. It filled the quiet moments between family laughter, between radio jingles, between life itself. Mornings began in that space, not quietly, but with a kind of chaotic joy. The smell of coffee percolating filled the air, rich and earthy, mingling with the sweet scent of toast and butter. The clatter of plates, the hiss of bacon on a skillet, the crunch of cereal poured into brightly colored bowls. Parents half awake, kids still rubbing sleep from their eyes. The kitchen table becoming command central before the day officially began. Cereal boxes were everywhere, bright, cartoonish, and endlessly fascinating. They weren't just breakfast, they were entertainment. You'd study them while eating, reading trivia, counting puzzle shapes, or searching for the tiny prize buried inside. Frosted Flakes, Captain Crunch, Lucky Charms, Trix, Cheerios. Every box had its mascot. Every mascot felt like a friend. You didn't think about sugar or nutrition, you thought about fun. Saturday mornings weren't complete without that sweet crunch echoing from every living room in the country. Mothers were the quiet architects of these mornings, though at the time, nobody thought about it that way. They made the house smell like safety. The sound of the frying pan was a soundtrack to childhood. Dads, too, had their rituals. The newspaper folded under one arm, the clink of a spoon in a coffee mug, a half smile while glancing at the headlines. Breakfast wasn't fancy, but it was sacred. And then there was lunch, the era of the brown paper bag. Bologna sandwiches with yellow mustard, peanut butter, and jelly pressed together until the bread turned slightly purple, an apple, maybe a cookie wrapped in wax paper. The smell of wax paper still brings back that specific memory, the anticipation of unwrapping something made just for you. Thermoses with soup that always seemed too hot or too cold, their metal lids clinking as you opened them. Sometimes you'd trade, sometimes you'd guard your sandwich like treasure. It wasn't gourmet, but it was real, proof that someone cared enough to pack it. Dinner, though, dinner was the moment everything slowed down again. The family table was a ceremony, even when it wasn't called that. The overhead light glowing yellow, the faint hum of a ceiling fan, the sound of chairs scraping as everyone found their place. A roast chicken resting proudly in the center, mashed potatoes with a small pool of butter melting in the middle, peas rolling off spoons, and a plate of store-bought rolls steaming in their basket. There was a rhythm to it all, a comfort in the repetition. Every family had its signature dish: meatloaf with ketchup glaze, spaghetti with sauce from a jar, tuna casserole with crushed potato chips on top. The food didn't have to be perfect, it just had to be shared. The dinner table was where stories were told, where jokes landed, where lessons slipped quietly into conversation. Sometimes voices rose, sometimes laughter drowned them out, but the ritual itself never broke. You sat together, you passed plates, you finished your vegetables because that's just what you did. And when you didn't sit together, the tray did the job. The invention of the TV dinner turned convenience into culture. Aluminum trays divided into neat little sections: mashed potatoes, peas, and a slice of turkey or Salisbury steak that looked identical no matter where you bought it. You'd pull back the foil, let it cool just enough, and sit cross-legged in front of the television, fork in hand, watching MASH Asterisk or Happy Days. The meal and the show blurred into one memory, the taste of gravy mixed with the laugh track from the other room. The clink of the fork against aluminum became a national sound. The packaging was half the fun. Swanson, Banquet, Stouffer's, their logos shining like promises. Each box showed a perfectly styled meal that no real tray ever quite matched, but nobody cared. It was food that came with the future, fast, easy, modern. Mothers didn't have to spend hours over the stove. Kids felt like astronauts eating out of compartments. Everyone won, or at least it felt that way. Still, nothing could replace the homemade touch. Kitchens in the 70s were laboratories of love and invention. Recipe cards written in looping cursive, stained with butter or sauce. were passed down and tucked into boxes beside cookbooks with names like The Joy of Cooking or Betty Crocker's Picture Cookbook. Every kitchen had a drawer filled with utensils that clinked and rattled, a spice rack that looked like a small apothecary, and an oven that seemed to work entirely by intuition rather than temperature. You could always tell what kind of family you were by the smell that hit you when you came home. Some smelled like casseroles, others like chili, some always like cookies, no matter what day it was. And cookies were everywhere. Toll House, oatmeal raisin, peanut butter with fork marks on top. Baking was a language of affection. Flour on the counter, the rhythmic scrape of a wooden spoon against a mixing bowl, the timer dinging from across the room. These were the sounds of childhood security. Even snacks had a kind of innocence. Cheese puffs left bright orange fingerprints on everything. Jell-O came in neon colors, wobbling proudly in glass bowls. Popcorn was made on the stove in heavy pans, shaking back and forth until the pop slowed, then poured into massive bowls that everyone reached into at once. Kids chewed bubble gum until their jaws hurt, shared candy bars cut in half, and drank soda from glass bottles so cold they made your fingers ache. Fast food was on the rise, though, and it changed the way people thought about eating. McDonald's wasn't just a restaurant, it was an experience. The Golden Arches stood like beacons at the edge of every town, promising fries that always tasted the same and milkshakes thick enough to outlast a car ride. Burger King had its flame-grilled scent that followed you for blocks. Wendy's, A&W, Taco Bell, they all carved out corners of American life, places where families gathered after little league games or road trips. The paper crowns, the ketchup packets, the sticky booths, they became part of growing up. Diners, too, held their charm. Chrome counters, vinyl booths, and jukeboxes at every table. A waitress calling everyone Han, refilling coffee without asking. The smell of pancakes and bacon blending with the sound of clinking silverware. Teenagers on dates, families after church, truckers passing through at midnight, all sharing the same space, the same comfort of hot food and a warm booth. And then there were the holidays, the true feasts of the decade. Thanksgiving tables overflowing with stuffing, cranberry sauce in perfect cylinder shapes straight from the can, green bean casseroles topped with crispy onions. Christmas cookies spread across every surface, some burned, some perfect. Easter hams, 4th of July cookouts, birthday cakes with waxy candles that dripped too fast. Every holiday had its own flavor, its own smell that marked time better than any calendar could. The drinks of the decade deserve their own memory. Kool-Aid pitchers in every color of the rainbow. Tab and Fresco in slim cans that hissed when opened. Root beer floats that turned to foam too fast to finish. Lemonade stands on the sidewalk where kids learned their first lessons in business and patience. And for the adults, coffee, endless coffee, poured into ceramic mugs that were always chipped but never replaced. Supermarkets of the 70s were their own sensory worlds. Fluorescent lights humming overhead, all filled with products in bold, unapologetic packaging. Cans stacked in pyramids, boxes promising new and improved every few months. There was a tactile joy in grocery shopping back then. The clack of cart wheels, the sound of paper bags being packed by hand, the little green stamps collected one by one. Even the freezer aisle felt like the future, rows of frosted glass doors revealing frozen possibilities behind them. The brands themselves became characters in our lives. Betty Crocker, Chef Boyardee, Aunt Jemima, the Pillsbury Doughboy with his soft little giggle. They weren't just marketing, they were comfort, voices of reassurance in every pantry. You trusted them because they never changed. You could close your eyes, open a can, and taste predictability, a flavor of safety. In every home, there was that one drawer full of takeout menus, even though takeout was still a novelty. Pizza boxes lined with grease stains, Chinese food in white cartons with red lettering. It was exotic back then, in the best possible way. A taste of something new, something from beyond the block. Families would crowd around the table, sharing egg rolls, passing chopsticks, laughing at fortune cookies that somehow always hit too close to home. For kids, food was entertainment as much as sustenance. Lunchboxes with superheroes on the front, filled with peanut butter sandwiches wrapped in wax paper, thermoses full of lukewarm soup, and maybe a Hostess cupcake if you were lucky. The smell of bologna and Crayola crayons mixed together in school cafeterias. A scent so distinct, it can still transport you back in an instant. But the truth is, food wasn't just about taste, it was about connection. You didn't eat alone often. There was always someone nearby, a parent, a sibling, a friend, even a neighbor who dropped by unannounced and left 2 hours later after being offered just a little something. Food was the language of love, of friendship, of community. You hungry was another way of saying, I care about you. Even as the world changed, as microwaves appeared on countertops, as margarine tried to replace butter, as diets came and went, the rituals of food remained. The passing of plates, the smell of bread baking, the clinking of silverware. It wasn't about perfection. It was about presence. There's a reason people remember the food of their childhood more vividly than almost anything else. It wasn't the recipes, it was the moments around them. The laughter at the table, the sound of the oven door opening, the feeling of sitting shoulder to shoulder, sharing something warm. Those little rituals anchored the chaos of growing up. And when you think back to it now, the glow of that kitchen, the smell of dinner on the stove, the sound of your family's voices mixing with the hum of the refrigerator, it feels like home in its purest form. Because it was. It wasn't about calories or presentation. It was about care. It was about being seen, being fed, being together. Even decades later, when you catch a familiar smell, fried onions, brewing coffee, apple pie cooling on a counter, something in you pauses. You're back there again, for just a second. Back in that kitchen with its yellow light and patterned wallpaper. Back in that moment when life was simpler, slower, and always centered around the table. The food of the 70s might have been humble, but it carried a kind of magic that modern meals rarely hold. The taste of belonging, of love served family style, of time itself slowing down just long enough for everyone to be together. The holidays of the 1970s seemed to exist in their own kind of light. Softer somehow, warmer. They didn't glow from LEDs or shimmer from high-definition screens. They glowed from the inside out, from the small, ordinary moments that gathered quietly around the kitchen table or the front porch, or the living room floor covered in torn wrapping paper. Back then, holidays weren't performances, they were pauses. The world seemed to slow down just enough for everyone to take a breath and remember who they were together. I can still feel the start of it, that first chill in the air, that first leaf that turned red and skittered across the pavement, that first afternoon when the sunlight looked more golden than bright. You could smell the season changing. Stores began to fill with decorations weeks before they were needed, and yet it never felt like too much. It felt like anticipation, the quiet hum of something good coming. The world still had mystery in it then. The days before a holiday stretched endlessly. like the slow climb of a roller coaster, each moment clicking upward towards something you could almost touch. Thanksgiving always came first, the warm-up for the grand parade of the season. It began in kitchens at sunrise, the house filled with the scent of onions and butter melting together in a pan. The oven door opened and closed like a heartbeat, releasing waves of heat that fogged the windows. The turkey, always too big for the roasting pan, sat in the center, glistening with a kind of authority. The radio played softly in the background, maybe Paul Simon or James Taylor, maybe the morning news. Someone always had to run out for one last forgotten ingredient, and someone else always said they didn't trust canned cranberry sauce, but served it anyway, complete with the ridges still molded from the can. The television stayed on all morning for the Macy's parade. Families half-watched, half-cooked, the commentary blending with the clatter of pots and pans. Kids sprawled on the carpet, plates of cinnamon rolls beside them, eyes wide as Snoopy or Underdog floated down the avenue. Every balloon looked impossibly huge. You could almost feel the cold New York air through the screen, the sound of brass bands echoing between the buildings. And then, when Santa finally arrived at the end of the parade, it was official. The holiday season had begun. Dinner itself was less an event than an atmosphere. Every chair in the house pressed into service, every table leaf inserted, every surface covered in food that no one could finish. The adults claimed they were pacing themselves, but everyone knew there would be pie later. Kids picked at rolls and olives, impatient for dessert. The conversations overlapped, stories about old relatives, jokes that had been told 100 times, laughter that rose and fell like music. There was always a point in the evening when everything got quiet, when someone leaned back in their chair, hands folded on their stomach, and sighed contentedly. That was the sound of gratitude, even if no one said it out loud. Then came Christmas, the main event of nostalgia itself. You could feel it weeks in advance, the way you feel a storm approaching. Decorations appeared slowly, one house at a time. Strings of colored bulbs tangled around porch railings, the smell of pine needles drifting from open doors, wreaths made of real branches that dropped tiny green needles on the floor every time someone came inside. The department stores were cathedrals of wonder back then. You could walk through aisles that smelled like tinsel and peppermint, the air thick with excitement. Every toy seemed magical. Every shelf glittered. Even the mannequins looked happier. There was a ritual to it all. Picking out the tree, driving home with it tied precariously to the roof of the car, wrestling it through the doorway while someone shouted instructions. The lights never worked the first time. Tangled cords spilled across the floor, bulbs blinking in random patterns. It didn't matter. You'd sit cross-legged, untangling them one by one, testing each socket like a patient mechanic. When the first strand finally glowed, everyone cheered quietly, as if it were proof that the season had officially arrived. The ornaments came next, a collection of memories more than decorations. Homemade ones made from popsicle sticks and glitter, heavy glass balls that reflected the room upside down. The occasional fragile heirloom that someone always insisted should be placed higher, out of reach. The smell of the tree filled the whole house, sharp and clean, like winter itself. And when the lights were finally strung and the ornaments found their places, the room transformed. You'd turn off the lamps, stand back, and just look. The glow of those multicolored bulbs against the tinsel, the soft shadow of the branches swaying slightly as warm air rose from the vents. It was like staring into something alive. Every night after that, you'd catch yourself standing there again, Lights out, the tree glowing in the dark. Presents slowly began to appear underneath, wrapped in shiny paper with ribbons curled by scissors. You'd count them, shake them, guess which one might be yours. The waiting was almost unbearable, and yet it was the best part. Christmas Eve felt endless, the air charged with magic and sugar. You'd hear your parents downstairs long after bedtime, the sound of paper rustling, the faint clink of dishes being put away, the murmured voices of adults carrying secrets you weren't meant to know. And then morning, the explosion of joy that could wake the dead. Bare feet on cold floors, the smell of coffee brewing, parents wrapped in robes and half-awake smiles. The living room transformed into a blur of color and laughter. Wrapping paper flying, ribbons landing on the dog, batteries being hunted for like buried treasure. Every gift felt personal, even the small ones. Socks, puzzles, model kits, record players, dolls. It didn't matter what you got. It was the fact that it was yours. But it wasn't the presence that lasted in memory. It was the music playing in the background. Bing Crosby, Nat King Cole, the Carpenters, soft voices filling the space between excitement and peace. It was the smell of cinnamon rolls baking in the oven, the sound of someone tearing tape with their teeth, the faint static from the record player when the needle lifted between songs. It was the sight of your family all together, still sleepy, still smiling, bathed in the soft glow of morning light and blinking Christmas bulbs. Later, as the day stretched on, the house took on a different kind of calm. Wrapping paper bagged and gone, toys half assembled, the dog asleep under the tree. Dinner preparations began again. Ham or turkey or roast beef, whatever tradition dictated. Relatives arrived, coats draped over chairs, voices filling every corner. The dining room table gleamed under the chandelier, candles flickering against polished silverware. It wasn't perfect. Something always burned. Someone always forgot the rolls in the oven. But perfection was never the point. The point was togetherness, that rare, precious feeling that for one day, the whole world was exactly where it should be. Outside, the air was cold and still. Snow, if you were lucky, blanketed everything in silence. You'd look out the window at the empty street, the faint glow of other houses, the occasional crunch of boots passing by. There was peace in that quiet, a kind of collective contentment that hung in the air. Inside, laughter spilled from room to room. The sound of dishes being cleared, the record player starting again, the low murmur of conversation. Every family had their quirks, their arguments, their imperfections, but on those nights, none of it mattered. The warmth won, and when the night ended, and the house went still again, you'd lie in bed staring at the ceiling, your heart full in a way you didn't yet have words for. The faint scent of pine and candle wax hung in the air. Somewhere down the hall, a record kept spinning quietly long after everyone else had fallen asleep. Other holidays carried their own kind of magic. Easter mornings with baskets filled with plastic grass and chocolate eggs that melted too quickly in your hands. Mothers ironing pastel dresses, fathers combing little boys' hair into place, everyone trying to look their best before church. The smell of lilies, the sound of hymns, the rustle of new clothes. Afterwards, there were egg hunts in the yard, baskets clutched tightly, laughter echoing as someone found the last one behind a flower pot. Lunch followed, ham, deviled eggs, potato salad, and the afternoon stretched lazily into contentment. The 4th of July was the opposite kind of joy, loud, bright, communal. The day began with parades that wound through small towns, floats decorated with crepe paper, kids waving flags, brass bands sweating under the summer sun. The smell of grilled hamburgers filled every backyard by noon, and the air hummed with cicadas and laughter. Sprinklers arched over lawns, fireworks stands appeared in parking lots, and by evening, everyone gathered on blankets under the sky. The fireworks themselves were imperfect, a little smoky, a little uneven, but they didn't need to be perfect. The oohs and ahs were enough. The real magic was the moment after, when the last spark faded and everyone sat quietly for a beat, the night suddenly darker and more intimate. Halloween in the 70s had its own thrill, a little rougher, a little freer than today. Costumes made at home from whatever you could find. Pillowcases for ghost sheets, cardboard swords, plastic masks that fogged up when you breathed. The streets filled with children carrying flashlights, laughter echoing down dark sidewalks. The air smelled like leaves and candy and the faint hint of mischief. Parents didn't hover. They trusted the night, and the night rewarded them with magic. Candy corn, Snickers, Milky Way, those tiny boxes of raisins nobody wanted but always ended up with anyway. The joy wasn't just in the treats. It was in the adventure of it, the mystery of knocking on a stranger's door and being welcomed with a smile. Even birthdays felt different back then. Simpler, but somehow grander. Streamers taped to the ceiling, paper hats that never quite fit, a homemade cake with candles that refused to stay lit. Kids crowded around the table, cheeks flushed with excitement, parents snapping photos with cameras that clicked and whirred. The gifts were small but perfect, a new toy, a book, maybe a record from your favorite band. What mattered most was the people in the room, the sound of their voices singing in unison. The moment the lights went out and the glow of the candles painted everyone's faces in gold. Traditions in those years weren't about money or display. They were about meaning. Families made their own, often by accident. A certain song always played while decorating the tree. A certain dish always appeared at every celebration. A joke told every year, still funny even when it wasn't. Those tiny repetitions became the rhythm of family life, markers of time that built identity without anyone noticing. Even the quiet moments between holidays held their own kind of comfort. Sunday dinners that felt ceremonial, backyard barbecues that turned into neighborhood gatherings. People made time for each other. You didn't need an excuse to visit. You just showed up, maybe with a pie, maybe with a story. The table always had room for one more chair. Looking back, it's easy to see that what we miss most about those holidays isn't the gifts or the decorations. It's the togetherness. It's the way time seemed to expand when everyone was in the same room. The way laughter filled the spaces between words. The way every small ritual, from unwrapping presents to carving a turkey, felt sacred simply because it was shared. Now, decades later, the holidays come faster and vanish sooner. But every once in a while, something brings them back. The sound of a carol playing faintly in a store, the smell of turkey roasting somewhere down the street, the flicker of colored lights through a window. And for a moment, you're back there, in that warm house, surrounded by family, the world outside covered in snow, and everything inside glowing softly. You remember the feel of wrapping paper in your hands, the taste of pumpkin pie, the sound of a parade on television. You remember belonging. The holidays of the 70s may be gone, but they live on in the simplest of things, a scent, a song, a flicker of memory that rises uninvited and lands softly on the heart. They remind us that joy was never about what we bought or how perfectly we celebrated. It was about presence, about being there, fully, with the people who mattered. That's what made it golden. That's what made it last. And when I think about it now, the glow of a Christmas tree in the dark, the laughter of family at a crowded table, the hush that falls just before the fireworks, I realize that the holidays didn't just mark the calendar. They marked us. They taught us what it meant to feel safe, to feel loved, to feel home. And maybe that's the greatest gift any era can give, a memory that still feels like warmth when the world gets cold. The 1970s didn't move fast, they flowed. Life had a rhythm that wasn't dictated by screens or schedules, but by the natural pulse of days unfolding one at a time. There was space between things back then, silence between songs on the radio, time between phone calls, distance between moments that made them linger. If you lived through it, you can still feel it in your bones, the texture of that decade. A little rough around the edges, but honest. A little uncertain, but full of life. The world wasn't perfect, but it was present. Mornings began slower, softer. The sunlight seemed warmer, golden in a way that's hard to explain. It came through windows patterned with lace curtains, dust motes floating like tiny galaxies in its beams. The sound of the day starting wasn't digital or mechanical. It was human. The creak of a floorboard, the clink of a spoon against a coffee cup, the hum of a radio easing the house awake. You didn't need to scroll through headlines to know what was happening. You just listened. The news came through the voice of a familiar anchor, the weather from a man you'd seen on TV for years, his smile as steady as the forecast. Even the air felt different. Cleaner, quieter. People noticed things more. The smell of rain on hot pavement, the sound of leaves scraping across the street in the fall, the way the air changed right before snow. The world still spoke in small ways, and people still had time to listen. There was a patience to life that's hard to find now. If you wanted to talk to someone, you called their house and hoped they were home. If they weren't, you waited. You didn't stare at a screen checking if they'd seen your message. You just trusted they'd get back to you. Letters were written, real ones, with ink and paper that carried fingerprints and smudges and personality. The mailman knew your name. You knew his. That simple exchange, a nod, a wave, a good morning, was part of the quiet fabric that held communities together. The world was smaller, but in a comforting way. Neighbors actually knew each other. You borrowed sugar, you lent tools, you shared casseroles after church. Kids ran between houses without calling ahead, knowing they'd be fed wherever they landed. People watched out for one another, not because they had to, but because they wanted to. The unspoken rule was simple: we take care of our own. The pace of everything had its own heartbeat. You didn't rush to fill silence. You let it breathe. Conversations had pauses. Music had space. Cars moved slower. Streets were quieter. There weren't 1,000 things competing for your attention. Just one moment at a time, fully lived. Maybe that's why memories from that decade feel so vivid now, because we actually noticed them as they happened. Driving was its own meditation. No GPS, no traffic apps, just maps folded and refold, creased like well-used memories. You could drive for hours with nothing but the radio and the road. The hum of the tires on asphalt, the hiss of air through a cracked window, the warmth of the vinyl seat sticking to your skin in the summer. Gas stations with attendants who smiled and cleaned your windshield. You handed over cash. They handed you a receipt, and that was it. No cards, no screens, just trust and small talk about the weather. Cities had texture. They weren't sterile or polished. They smelled like coffee and diesel and hot pavement. Downtowns buzzed with life, but never felt overwhelming. Storefronts were personal. Diners had regulars. Laundromats had bulletin boards covered in notes, flyers, lost cat posters, and babysitting ads. Every place had a sense of ownership, not from corporations, but from people. The butcher knew which cut of meat you liked. The mechanic knew your car's quirks better than you did. There was pride in being part of something small. Evenings belonged to the living room. The TV hummed, families gathered, lamps glowed instead of screens. There was a sense of ritual in the way the day ended. Lights dimmed, slippers came out, the news wrapped up, and you could almost feel the world exhale. The commercials between shows were just as familiar as the programs themselves. Jingles so catchy, they still live somewhere in the back of your mind. The rhythm of the house slowed. The refrigerator clicked on and off in the kitchen, the clock ticked from the wall, and life felt manageable. Money was tighter, sure. The gas crisis hit, prices rose, and people worried about jobs. But worry had a different shape then. It was quieter, steadier, faced with resilience rather than panic. People didn't expect comfort all the time. They expected to work for it. When things broke, you fixed them. When times got tough, you adapted. The pride wasn't in having everything. It was in making do with what you had. Music carried emotions that words couldn't. It wasn't background noise. It was atmosphere. Every song told a story, not through auto-tune perfection, but through feeling. Fleetwood Mac, the Eagles, Carole King, Simon and Garfunkel, Elton John, they didn't just make hits, they made soundtracks to life. You'd hear a song and instantly remember where you were the first time you heard it, who you were with, what the air smelled like, what you were feeling. Music wasn't disposable, it was immortal. You didn't skip tracks, you listened, start to finish. Records had weight, physically and emotionally. You lifted the needle carefully, placed it down gently, and sat back as the first crackles filled the room. There was space in those songs for memory to grow. You didn't multitask through them, you experienced them. Driving with the windows down, radio up, the world passing in blurs of sunlight and shadow. That was meditation before anyone called it that. Friendship had a different flavor. You didn't text, you showed up. You knocked on doors, you sat on porches, you lingered. You made eye contact when you talked. Conversations meandered, drifted, deepened. You didn't have to catch up every few months because you never really drifted apart. You lived in the same rhythm. People stayed connected not because it was easy, but because it mattered. And romance, it unfolded slower too. Love letters, mixtapes, long phone calls that stretched into the early morning until you both fell asleep with the receiver still pressed to your ear. You memorized someone's handwriting, their favorite song, their scent. There wasn't instant access or constant contact, so every moment together carried weight. Holding hands felt like a secret. A kiss felt cinematic. The seasons marked time more vividly back then. Summer wasn't a scrolling highlight reel. It was heat shimmering on asphalt, popsicles melting down your wrist, sprinklers hissing in backyards. Autumn was the crunch of leaves under sneakers, the smell of bonfires, the hum of football games echoing from nearby fields. Winter was real, cold enough to sting, magical enough to forgive it. Snow days meant everything stopped. No online classes, no work from home. Just silence, laughter, and the sound of boots crunching through fresh powder. Spring meant starting over. Windows open for the first time, air smelling faintly of rain and new grass. People cleaned their houses top to bottom, not for minimalism or trend, but because it felt good to reset. The world smelled like soap and optimism. Work itself was slower, too. Offices buzzed with typewriters, not notifications. Phones rang, papers shuffled, coffee brewed in glass pots that crackled from overuse. People smoked at their desks, laughed louder, lingered longer. The workplace wasn't about metrics, it was about people. You knew your coworkers' families, their moods, their dreams. There was less efficiency, maybe, but more humanity. And after work, people disconnected, truly disconnected. You left the office, and you left it behind. You went home, not to another screen or another inbox, but to dinner, to family, to rest. You didn't live to work, you worked to live. And somehow, that balance gave the world its soul. Even the imperfections of the era had their charm. The wallpaper patterns too loud, the cars that rattled on cold mornings, the televisions that needed a smack on the side to fix the picture. All of it felt real. You could see the fingerprints of human effort on everything. Things weren't sleek or seamless, but they had character. They had soul. There was an optimism that lived underneath the struggles. People believed in progress, not in the sense of constant improvement, but in the belief that tomorrow could still be better. The moon landing had just happened. Technology was advancing, but it hadn't yet taken over. People still trusted people more than machines. The world was changing, yes, but the pace of that change was human-sized. You could keep up. You could walk through a neighborhood at dusk and hear laughter from open windows, the sound of television shows overlapping, someone practicing piano, someone else mowing the lawn. The air was alive with life. You didn't need noise to feel connected. Connection was everywhere already. Sundays carried their own gravity. Mornings smelled like pancakes and coffee. Afternoons meant family drives or quiet walks. Stores closed early, streets emptied. The day felt like a collective breath. People read newspapers front to back, not just headlines. They listened to records, mended clothes, called relatives. The world didn't demand your attention, it invited it. Even boredom felt different. It wasn't something to escape, it was something to explore. You'd lie on the floor, stare at the ceiling, and let your mind wander. You'd daydream, invent games, build forts, or simply be. Out of that silence came imagination. Out of that stillness came peace. Life wasn't cleaner or easier. It was messy, but it was real. People argued more face to face, forgave more slowly, and remembered longer. Mistakes weren't erased with a delete key. They lingered. They taught you. They changed you. That's what made the bonds stronger, the lessons deeper, the memories more permanent. Even fear felt smaller. The world had dangers, yes, but they weren't constantly broadcasted. You didn't carry the entire planet's anxiety in your pocket. You just dealt with your own corner of it, your town, your people, your worries, and somehow that was enough. There was loneliness, too, but even that had texture. You could feel it. You could sit with it. You could hear your own thoughts without distraction. It wasn't comfortable, but it was grounding. Silence taught you who you were. Looking back now, it's easy to romanticize the decade, to smooth out the rough parts and remember only the glow. But that glow was real. It came from people, not things. From time, not speed. From being present, not busy. The 70s were imperfect, but they were alive. Every crack in the sidewalk, every creak in a door hinge, every song fading in and out of static on a car radio. It all felt alive. If you close your eyes, you can still feel it. The hum of a fluorescent light in a grocery store. The smell of gasoline mixed with rain. The sound of a record skipping softly. then continuing like nothing happened. A world where time stretched instead of shrank, where you could breathe without guilt. It wasn't a perfect decade, but it was a human one. Life moved at the speed of conversation, not connection speeds. People didn't need constant validation, they had presence. They didn't need constant noise, they had melody. When I think about it now, I don't miss the things, I miss the pace. The slowness that made every detail matter. The patience that allowed moments to grow roots. The trust that came from looking someone in the eye instead of at a screen. The 70s taught us that life doesn't have to be spectacular to be meaningful. Sometimes it's the ordinary that stays with you. The hum of an appliance, the click of a typewriter, the laughter of a neighbor through an open window. Those were the sounds of living. And maybe that's what nostalgia really is. Not a longing for a decade, but for a feeling. A way of being in the world when the world itself felt smaller, kinder, and slower. When we didn't just exist in moments, we lived inside them. The soul of the 70s wasn't found in its trends or its fashion. It lived in its pace. It lived in its people. It lived in the simple beauty of being fully there. And even now, all these years later, if you stop and listen closely, beneath the static, beneath the rush, you can still hear it. The heartbeat of a time when life was quieter, but somehow infinitely louder in meaning.